They threw me away the day I was born. 5 years later, when their king collapsed, the only one who could save him was me.
I remember the first sound I ever made in this world, a cry. Not because I wanted to cry, but because that is what newborns do. And the body I had just been placed inside was not interested in my opinion on the matter. The midwife said something kind. She held me up toward a woman with chestnut hair that fell in loose waves past her shoulders, and eyes the same warm brown, wet with tears she was already failing to hide. "A healthy boy, my lady," the midwife said. The woman took me, Margaret. I did not know her name yet. I did not know anything yet, except that the arms holding me were shaking, and that the voice above me kept breaking on words I could not parse. She said it quietly, almost to herself. A boy, not celebration, confirmation. Like a doctor reading a result she had been dreading. I had no frame for any of it. I was an hour old in a body that could not hold its own head up, and the only thing I understood with certainty was that I had been here before. Not this room, not this world, but this exact situation. Born, held briefly, and about to be set down. In my last life, I was found outside a hospital on a warm morning. My mother was arrested from surveillance footage. She never visited. My father was listed as unknown. I grew up in an orphanage where the house mother belonged to everyone, and therefore to no one. And I learned early that warmth was a resource with a schedule, not a constant. I worked restaurants after I aged out. The chain went under. I did odd jobs. I got sick. I fell asleep one evening with a fever and did not wake up. No one was at the bedside. There was no bedside. There was a futon on the floor of a one-room apartment, and whatever I caught killed me quietly enough that I do not remember the moment it happened. And now I was here, a different world, a different body, a language I had never studied but somehow understood, and a mother who was crying before I had been alive for 5 minutes. That should have been my first warning. In another wing of the palace, two people who normally could not stand each other were having the same conversation. I learned about this later, not from them, from the brothers who spent years putting the pieces together. But I will tell it now, because you deserve to see the hands that moved before I could open my eyes. Queen Julia sat in a room that cost more than most villages earned in a year. Dark brown hair braided tight, heavy makeup, the expression of a woman who had just found a stain on an expensive dress. The stain was me. Her faction controlled the eldest prince. The chancellor's faction controlled the second. Between them, they had carved up the succession like a roast, and every seat was accounted for. A third male heir, born to the king's own tutor, broke the math. The law was clear. A male child born to the king and a noble woman held a claim to the throne. I was a piece neither side had planned for, and neither side wanted to reshuffle. Chancellor Grant sat across from her, silver hair streaked white, slicked back, tall and thin with the posture of a man who had outlived everyone who had ever tried to remove him. His grandson Carter was his candidate for king. He had murdered Carter's mother after she gave birth, because a living consort was a complication he did not need. That is the kind of man he was, efficient about people. The queen wanted me gone because I threatened her son's claim. The chancellor wanted me gone because I threatened his grandsons. They arrived at the same conclusion from opposite directions, and for one evening, rivalry paused. King Arthur was irrelevant to this discussion. He had never been relevant to any discussion. Fourth son of a dead king, crowned only because his brothers died first, and he had responded to the job by drinking and assaulting every woman who entered the palace. His only contribution to the kingdom was a congenital fertility problem so severe that the capital whispered he could not father children at all. He could. I was proof, and that proof needed to disappear. They agreed. Kill the child or abandon him. Margaret was too useful as the prince's educator to dispose of, but the baby had no such protection. They delivered the order that night. On my third day alive, I met my brothers. Margaret had been nursing me in a small room off the tutor's wing. Not a royal chamber, a working room with a desk and shelves and a narrow window that let in the kind of light that made everything look tired. She had been crying again, or still. I could not tell the difference yet. The door opened without announcement. Two boys walked in, alone. No guards, no servants. They had come by themselves, which meant they had chosen to come, which meant something, even if I could not yet understand what. The first one was 10 years old, with short golden hair and a face that was already trying to be composed. He looked down at me in the basket and his jaw tightened. "So, this is my younger brother." Alex's voice was quiet and level, the way a child sounds when he is imitating an adult he respects. He has the same gold hair. The second boy was also 10, with silver hair cut to his jawline and eyes that were not quiet at all. Carter looked at me, and then at Margaret, and then back at me, and his hands balled into fists at his sides. Why does he have to be thrown away? The words came out cracked, furious. This is wrong. Margaret did not answer. She was holding me against her shoulder, and her hand was on the back of my head, and she was shaking again. I registered all of this from the limited vantage of an infant pressed against a collarbone. Two boys at the edge of my vision. A room too small for the grief inside it. A woman who had taught these children everything they knew. The closest thing to a parent either of them had. Holding a baby she would not be allowed to keep. Alex stepped closer. His formality cracked just enough to show the boy underneath. Teacher, I am sorry. We do not have the power to stop this. Carter did not bother with formality. I am sorry too. His voice broke on it. Margaret's grip on me tightened. The two boys looked at each other. Some communication passed between them that I was too new to read but old enough to recognize. A decision made silently, confirmed with a glance, sealed before anyone in the palace knew it had happened. Teacher, please continue to educate us. Alex straightened. We need you. Carter wiped his face with his sleeve. When we are old enough, we will make this kingdom what it should be. They said the last part together, like a vow rehearsed on the walkover. It did not matter whether it was. They meant it. I did not know any of this at the time. I was 3 days old. I could not do anything except exist in a basket while two children I would not see again for years promised a woman I would not recognize for even longer that they would come back for what was being taken. Margaret answered them. Her voice was steady in the way that costs everything. I understand. I will teach you and the princesses with everything I have until you are ready. She paused. And when you are, perhaps then I can go to where my son is. I did not understand that sentence until years later. She was not talking about visiting. She was talking about being done, raising 4 royal children, finding the 5th, and then resting, whatever resting meant. That was my 3rd day. On the 5th day, I woke up in a forest. I had fallen asleep in Margaret's arms after nursing. That was the last thing I remembered. Her warmth, the rhythm of her breathing, the smell of her hair. When I opened my eyes, the ceiling was gone. The arms were gone. I was lying in a wicker basket on a bed of cloth, and above me was nothing but branches and sky. The air was different, warmer, damp. Insects buzzing somewhere nearby, grass rustling in a breeze I could feel on my face. No mother, no midwife, no palace walls. I was alone in a forest, and I was 5 days old, and I had been here before. Not this forest, not this basket, but this exact feeling. The quiet of a place where you have been put down and no one is coming back. In my first life, it was a hospital doorstep in warm weather. In this one, it was a forest floor near the Banzas barony, placed there by the only person who loved me because the alternative was a knife. Margaret had been escorted here by the palace guard. She placed me in the basket. She tucked in an envelope containing a letter and a pendant. The letter named me. The pendant bore the crest of the Lineglide barony, her family's house. She knelt on the forest floor and prayed for 1 minute, 60 seconds. That was all she was allowed. Then she was taken back to the palace. I know this because it was reconstructed later. At the time, I knew none of it. I knew the weave of the basket pressing into my back, the sound of wind through leaves, the hunger, and the cold understanding that the warmth I had been borrowing for 5 days was gone. Time passed, an hour, maybe 2, long enough for fear to settle into something quieter and worse. In my last life, they found me in the morning. In this one, there was no hospital, no morning shift, no surveillance camera, just a forest the Chancellor had chosen because it was full of animals. I thought about dying, not dramatically, practically. If no one found me, I would starve. A newborn cannot last long without milk. The arithmetic was simple. Then the bushes moved. What came out of the undergrowth was not a person. It was a dog, enormous, tawny fur, broad skull, a face that filled my entire field of vision from the basket. He looked like an oversized version of something I had seen in picture books in my past life, except bigger and considerably more real. He sniffed me. His nose was wet and cold and covered most of my face. Then he licked my cheek. One long, deliberate stroke. I froze. Partly because freezing was most of my physical repertoire. Partly because I genuinely did not know if I was about to be eaten. He did not eat me. He clamped his jaws gently around the basket handle and lifted. The world tilted. Branches and sky slid sideways, and then we were moving. The dog carried me onto the road at a trot that rocked the basket like a boat in a current, forward and back, forward and back. My first ride in this world, courtesy of a dog whose name I would later learn was Wolf. It was the most nauseating experience of either of my lives, but I was moving away from the spot where I had been left to die, and the thing carrying me had chosen to pick me up. That counted for something. Wolf, what have you got? A man's voice called from up ahead. He is carrying a basket. A woman's voice, calm and clear. 2 figures appeared on the road. The woman had long green hair in a ponytail, green eyes, and ears that came to narrow points no human ear had any business coming to. An elf. The man had a broad build, a warm face, and canine ears on top of his head. A tail flickered behind him. A beastman. Lena took the basket from Wolf and peered down at me. I stared up at her pointed ears while my stomach recovered from the ride. Bard leaned in over her shoulder. Another abandoned kid? That is the second one this year. A human child this time. Lena tilted her head. Still newborn. Cannot be more than a few days old. Wolf barked once, as though confirming a job well done. I was babbling. In my head, I was thinking coherent thoughts, but what came out was the standard output of a 5-day-old infant. Lena smiled at it. This one talks a lot for a baby in a basket in the middle of the woods, she said. Bard scratched Wolf behind the ears. Same as last time. We take him to the guild? Wolf licked my face again. I did not have the motor control to wipe it off. They carried me down the road toward the town. The guild smelled like sweat and old leather. Bard walked through the main hall with the basket held out, Wolf trotting alongside with the proprietary air of a dog who had found something and intended everyone to know it. "Guildmaster," Bard called. Found another one. The guildmaster was a large man, scarred face, heavy arms, the posture of someone who had spent decades hitting things and then decades more telling other people to. He looked at the basket. He looked at me. Another abandoned child. He shook his head. "What is happening out here?" "There is an envelope in the basket," Lena said. "We should read it privately." He led them into a back room and closed the door. I was placed on the floor, still in the basket. Wolf lay down beside me and rested his chin on the rim. I was hungry. The conversation above me was important, but my stomach did not care about politics. The guildmaster opened the envelope. He read the letter first. His face went through several changes in quick succession, none of them good. It says, "Please take care of my child. His name is..." He stopped, read it again, looked at my hair. Lena pulled the pendant from the envelope. She turned it over in her fingers. I recognized this crest. I took a commission from them once. "This belongs to the Lineglide barony." The guildmaster sat down heavily. "The king's tutor," he said. "The one the whole capital has been talking about. The baron's daughter he assaulted. She was from the Lineglide house." Bard's tail went still. "So this baby is a prince." The guildmaster stared at me as though I had done something personally offensive by existing. "This child has a claim to the throne of the Amaru kingdom, and someone tucked him into a basket and left him in a forest full of wild beasts." The room went quiet. Even Wolf seemed to understand the weight of it. His ears flattened. I was focused on starving, but the adult part of me registered every word. A prince. Born to a baron's daughter the king had assaulted. Placed in a forest and left for whatever found me first. Twice now. Two different worlds. The details changed. The story did not. The guildmaster rubbed his scarred jaw. "We cannot report this upward. The two factions fighting over the throne would crush this child the moment they learned he was alive, and contacting the baron's family directly could make it worse. So, what do we do with him?" Bard asked. "I keep the pendant. I have contacts in the military who stay neutral in succession politics. I will investigate quietly." He looked at the letter again. "The child goes to the local orphanage. No royal name, just another foundling. It is the safest place for him until I understand what we are dealing with." Lena nodded slowly. "The military is the only neutral institution left. That is a reasonable path." The guildmaster folded the letter and placed it with the pendant into a locked drawer. He looked at me with something that was not quite pity and not quite respect. Acknowledgement, maybe, that I was alive and that keeping me that way was going to be more complicated than it should be. I, meanwhile, had reached my limit. I cried, not because of the revelation, because I was a newborn infant, and I had not eaten since Margaret's arms, and my body did not care about anything else. The cry was loud. It was the one tool I had, and I used it without shame. "He is hungry," Lena said quietly. Bard shook his head. "Has not eaten since we found him." The guildmaster stood. "My wife is still nursing our youngest." He left. Wolf pressed his warm side against the basket, and for the first time since the forest, the shaking in my chest began to slow. The guildmaster's wife came. She asked no questions, picked me up, and fed me. The milk was warm, and I drank until I could not keep my eyes open. I fell asleep in a stranger's arms, in a guild office, in a town I had never heard of, in a world I had not chosen. The letter that named me was in a locked drawer. The pendant that identified my family was beside it. The mother who had left both was back at the palace, teaching the children of the people who had ordered me thrown away. The chain of fate was already in motion. The guildmaster would investigate. The military contacts would find something. Years later, two boys who had stood at the foot of my basket on my third day of life would follow those threads all the way to a provincial orphanage. But none of that had happened yet. For now, I was alive. I was fed. I was warm. And somewhere in the back of my mind, beneath the infant fog, The adult who had died alone on a futon in a cold apartment thought, "This is the second time the world has thrown me away. Maybe this time someone will come back." I did not believe it, but I let myself think it. That was enough for day 5. The orphanage smelled like boiled herbs and old wood, and I did not mind. I had slept in worse in my last life, or at least I assumed I had, since that life ended on a hospital cot with nobody at the bedside and no particular fanfare. This one had Dolly arguing with Anna about whether the second batch needed another 10 minutes, Gordon dozing against the wall like a small furry boulder, and nobody particularly dying. As orphanages went, I had done considerably worse. I picked up the stirring rod and went back to work. 5 years had passed since the forest. In that time, I had gone from a newborn who could do nothing but observe to a boy who could talk, walk, and boil antidote herbs in a kitchen that doubled as a laboratory. 8 of us lived in a single house at the edge of the Banzas barony. No staff, no budget, and a director who appeared once a year in spring to collect the oldest children for apprenticeships nobody ever heard from again. I did not like thinking about where those children went. Anna ran the house, 12 years old, a dragonoid with pale blue hair and small curved horns, and she kept the ledger balanced with the quiet ferocity of someone who knew that if she stopped, we starved. Gus was the same age, gray-furred, dog beastman, blunt, strong, protective. He went out with Anna and the angel twins Lala and Lily on monster contracts and came back carrying whatever the forest offered. Gordon, the bear cub, 6 years old and brown-furred and kind, hauled water and washed bottles and let anyone who needed comfort lean against him. Dolly, nearly 10, was a cat beastman with sharp ears and a sharper mind, my partner in the kitchen. And Layla was 3, a demon child with tiny bat wings and lamb horns, who floated around us telling everyone to stop talking and get back to work. I loved them. I had decided that somewhere around year 2, without announcing it, they were the closest thing to a family I had built in either life. The potions were how we survived. The forest behind the orphanage grew medicinal herbs year-round. The guildmaster, the same scarred man who had taken me in as an infant, sent a pharmacist friend to teach us the basics. Dolly and I turned out to have a knack for it, but the real edge was something I kept quiet. I had appraisal magic. Humans and beastmen were not supposed to use magic in this world, yet I could cast it, a spell that read the composition of anything I touched. I used it to adjust every batch in real time, a little more steeping, a slightly lower flame. Within a year, our potions were reading at 4 times the standard guild grade. Dolly caught on. She held up 2 bottles side by side one afternoon and said the one I checked always came out better. I told her it was instinct. She did not buy it, but she did not push. Instead, she started handing me everything to verify, and together, we rebuilt the recipe from scratch. We soaked the herbs in cold water first to pull bitterness, Anna's idea, from cooking, then simmered gently and let residual heat do the extraction. We chopped the antidote grass fine because my appraisal told me surface area mattered. The adventurers said ours were better than anything they could find in the capital. I filed that away. If a shed was outperforming trained pharmacists with proper equipment, something in the capital was very broken. The compound antidote was Dolly's breakthrough. The standard method, mixing a finished healing potion with a finished antidote, failed, the 2 formulas neutralizing each other. Her insight was to use the healing potion as a solvent and steep fresh antidote grass directly into it. I appraised, she measured. Layla, floating between us with no magical basis I could detect, announced when the color looked right. She was always right. 4 bottles cooled on the table, 4 times normal antidote strength, with the healing effect still intact. We need to standardize the amounts before we scale up. Dolly's ears flattened the way they did when she was trying not to look pleased. Agreed, and we tell the guildmaster first this time. I did not know it yet, but those 4 bottles were going to save 4 lives that mattered to me more than I could have imagined. Bard and Lena still came by. Once a month, the adventurers who had pulled me from the basket showed up with dried meat and secondhand clothes. Wolf came with them, the same enormous dog who had carried me out of the forest. Grayer around the muzzle now, but his tail still went up the instant he saw me. He still licked my face like it was his sworn duty. Layla climbed onto his back every time. The 2 of them circled the yard together. She had been found by Wolf too, as an infant, and the bond between them was older than her memory of it. Still making potions? Bard ruffled my hair. Still making potions. Lena set down a bundle of smoked rabbit. The guildmaster says your quality keeps climbing. I said thank you, and I meant it, and I went back inside to wash bottles. Praise still felt like something that could be retracted without notice. The king died on a Tuesday. The guild hall was buzzing when we arrived with our latest batch. The receptionist told me when I asked, the king was dead. The two princes were negotiating succession. I set the crate on the counter and felt something cold move through my chest. My father, a man I had never met, a man whose assault on a woman named Margaret had produced me, and whose court had thrown me into a forest 5 days later. Anna noticed me standing still. I told her the news. Gus patted my head. King dies. Nothing changes for us. We still make potions. He was right. But I kept thinking about the two boys who had stood over my crib. They were teenagers now. The people who had tried to have me killed were still in that palace. I hoped nothing would bleed. What I learned later was this. Alec and Carter had not been idle. For 7 years, since the night they stood over my crib, they had been building. They recruited the captain of the Royal Guard and the Minister of Military Affairs. They gathered evidence of corruption. They found me at the Banza's orphanage and chose, painfully, not to extract me, because surfacing a third male heir while the Queen and Chancellor held power would have gotten me killed within the hour. They told Margaret I was alive. She wept and said knowing was enough. The night the king died, Alec walked into the chamber where the body lay frozen in a ceremonial coffin. The Queen and the Chancellor were there, performing grief, weeping with their mouths turned upward at the corners. Alec knelt, prayed for exactly as long as custom required, then stood and announced that as first in the succession, he was assuming the regent proxy under domestic law. Carter flanked him. The twins flanked Carter. The Queen opened her mouth and found nothing legal to object to. They had spent years planning a power grab. He had spent years planning a lawful transfer. The funeral, the succession declaration, the ceremony 5 days out. All of it already staffed with loyalists. A 17-year-old had taken the room from the two most powerful schemers in the kingdom. Back at the orphanage, I knew none of this. What I knew was that the guildmaster came 3 days before the succession declaration and asked Dolly and me to increase production. He said the military needed stock. His voice said otherwise. Dolly heard it too. After he left, we had the conversation without speaking. Standard potions for the order. Materials reserved for another batch of the compound antidote. Nobody asked us to do that. We did it because the guildmaster's tone had carried something he was not saying, and because I had learned in my last life that when someone important asks you to hurry, the emergency is always worse than the one they describe. The orphanage shifted into production mode. Anna redirected the team to herb collection. Gus and the twins came back with baskets overflowing. Gordon washed bottles at the well until his fur was soaked. Layla supervised from the air, puffing her cheeks at anyone who slowed down. The guildmaster carried our 4 compound antidote bottles to the capital himself. In a private room at guild headquarters, the Minister of Military Affairs confirmed their potency and ordered one distributed to each of the 4 royal children. Insurance, because there had already been poisoning attempts on the prince's attendants, and the capital's own pharmacy guild had been producing fraudulent medicine for years. 5 days before the succession declaration, the Queen and the Chancellor made their move. Alec was poisoned first, a compound toxin formulated to defeat standard antidotes, the kind you commission when you have already calculated the countermeasure will fail. He survived because my compound antidote was already in his hand. Within the hour, Carter, Scarlet, and Lillian were poisoned with the same compound. 3 more bottles deployed, 3 more lives held. I did not know any of this. What I knew was that the guildmaster sent word, urgent, produce everything, strong antidote included. Do not ask why. So Dolly and I worked. We worked until the lamp burned low and the kitchen smelled like nothing but herb steam and hot glass. Gordon had fallen asleep against the wall. Layla had drifted off midair and settled onto a pile of clean rags. Dolly bottled the last vial. Something bad happened. Yes, she corked it and set it in the crate. Then we make more tomorrow. I stood at the basin with my hands in water that had gone cold. Somewhere out there, people I had never met were alive because of what we had mixed in this room. I did not know they were my brothers. I did not know they were my sisters. I only knew the guildmaster's voice had cracked on the word urgent, and that whatever was happening in the capital was not over. I dried my hands. I checked the herb stores. I set aside enough antidote grass for 3 more batches. Then I sat on the kitchen floor and waited for morning, because there was nothing else to do, and because I had learned a long time ago, in a life before this one, that the hardest part of caring about people is the hours when you cannot reach them. I thought we were done. Dolly and I had finished the last batch just before sundown. Every bottle we could manage, every healing potion and antidote the guildmaster had asked for, lined up in crates on the kitchen floor. Anna handed me a glass of sweet juice and told me to sit down. Layla climbed into my lap, tucked her horns under my chin, and went still. For about 10 minutes, I believed the crisis was over. Then the front door opened hard enough to rattle the drying rack, and the guildmaster walked in with a face I had never seen on him. Not angry, not worried. Something past both of those. The look of a man running calculations on time he did not have. Adrian, Dolly. His voice was flat and fast. The strong antidote. Can you still make it? Yes. I did not hesitate. I kept the materials back. Enough for 4 bottles. Good, make them now. Someone has been poisoned with a compound toxin, and nobody else in this kingdom can touch it. Dolly was already on her feet. She crossed to the work table and pulled the reserved herbs from the drawer without a word. The same drawer I had quietly set aside 3 days ago, on instinct, because the guildmaster's earlier urgency had felt like a warning with no name on it yet. We worked fast. The method was the same as before. Fresh antidote grass steeped directly into the healing potion base, heated slow, the active compound drawn out by patience rather than force. I appraised every stage. Layla, still balanced on Anna's hip, called the color shift before I confirmed it. She was right. She was always right. 4 bottles, 4 corks. I held one up to the lamp, and the liquid inside was clear gold with a faint green thread running through it. Done. The guildmaster examined each one and nodded once. Then he said something I was not expecting. Pack up, all of you. The whole orphanage is coming with me. Anna's voice cut through the room. All of us? Where? The royal capital. There is a carriage outside the guild right now. Nobody spoke for 3 full seconds. I could hear Layla's wings buzzing against Anna's shoulder. We locked the orphanage and walked to the guild in a tight cluster. Gordon padded alongside Anna. Gus carried the crate of antidote bottles on one shoulder like it weighed nothing. Layla rode on Anna's back, her usual chatter gone. The guild was different. Every adventurer inside sat quiet, and in the center of the floor stood a half-dozen men in armor, more ornate than anything the barony had ever seen. Polished steel with gold inlay, formal military capes, swords that were not decorative. Those are royal knights, Gus muttered. His fur was bristling. The guildmaster confirmed the bottles one final time, then jerked his head toward the door. Outside, move. The carriage was the largest I had ever seen. Rich dark wood, brass fittings, curtained windows, and a team of 4 horses stamping in the torchlight. It belonged in a painting, not in front of our guild. We climbed in. The seats were upholstered in something soft I did not have a word for. Gordon settled against Anna's legs and closed his eyes. Dolly sat beside me with the potion crate wedged between her knees. Gus took the seat facing backward and kept his arms crossed, watching the knights form up around us. The carriage lurched forward. I watched the barony slip away through a gap in the curtain, the forest where I had been left as a baby, the road I walked to the guild every week, the only home I had ever had. I suspected, as the wheels found the highway and the pace doubled, that the patient was someone important, someone royal. The guildmaster had said the capital, and the knights outside were not guild escorts. They were palace guards. My mind went to the brothers I had never met, Alec, Carter, the names I knew only from the letter Margaret had left in my basket, and from things the guildmaster had let slip over the years. One of them was dying, I thought. One of my brothers had been poisoned, and our antidote was the only thing that could save him. I was almost right. Almost. The ride was long enough for the sky to go from amber to black. Nobody talked much. Layla, who never sat still for longer than a meal, stayed in Anna's arms the entire time without a word. She was 3 years old, and she could feel the danger in the air the way other children felt cold. I leaned toward the guildmaster. Where exactly are we going? A baron's mansion in the noble district, not the palace. He paused. You will be safe. I was not asking about safe. I was asking who is dying. He looked at me for a long moment. The carriage rocked. Outside, hooves rang on packed earth in a rhythm that felt like counting down. You will see, he said. Nothing else. I let it go. There was no point pressing a man who had already decided what to tell me. The forest thinned. The road widened. And then, through the curtain gap, I saw the capital for the first time. A sprawl of rooftops and towers spreading across a valley, lit by thousands of torches and lanterns that turned the horizon into a low amber glow. This was the city where I had been born, where a queen and a chancellor had looked at a newborn and decided he was better off dead, where my mother had wrapped me in cloth and carried me into a forest because the alternative was a knife. I had thought about this city exactly once in 5 years. I had decided it did not matter, but sitting in that carriage, watching it grow larger through the glass, I could feel something tightening in my chest that I did not have a name for. The carriage passed the gate checkpoint without stopping. The knights flashed something at the guards, and we rolled straight straight through. Streets blurred past. Market stalls shuttered for the night, lamplit windows. A drunk stumbling out of a tavern. Then the houses grew larger, the walls higher, the streets quieter. Noble district. The carriage turned into a gated courtyard and stopped. A butler was waiting at the door before we had fully climbed out. He bowed once, said nothing except, "This way, please," and moved. He moved fast. The kind of fast that meant someone in the building was running out of time. The hallway was longer than our entire orphanage. Stone floors polished to a shine, candles in iron brackets, paintings I did not stop to look at. Everyone else's legs were longer than mine. Gordon, a year older and built like a small bear, pulled ahead easily. Anna carried Layla. Gus walked just behind the guildmaster with the crate. Dolly matched my pace and stayed beside me. I was a 5-year-old boy in a borrowed tunic, carrying nothing but what I knew. The hallway did not care. It kept going. "Almost there," the butler said over his shoulder. Almost there meant another turn, another corridor, and then a heavy wooden door that the butler opened without knocking. The room was large and quiet in the wrong way. The kind of quiet that gathers around a bed when the person in it is losing. An elderly couple stood beside the daybed. The woman had her hands clasped so tightly, her knuckles had gone white. The man stood behind her with one hand on her shoulder, his jaw locked, his eyes red. Servants hovered near the walls, doing nothing useful because there was nothing useful left to do. And on the daybed, a young woman, late 20s maybe, chestnut hair spread across the pillow. Her skin was gray. Her breathing was shallow and uneven. Each inhale a small fight she was barely winning. Her lips had no color. I ran my appraisal before anyone gave me permission. The reading came back in layers, the way it always did when something was complicated. 2 compounds, slow acting, both of them, designed to erode rather than strike. The kind of poison that let the victim linger for days while hope slowly drained out of the room. And then the labels. My appraisal returned source attribution when the compound signature was distinct enough, and these 2 were unmistakable. Custom court-grade reagents, unique formulation profiles. The first label read, Queen Julia. The second, Chancellor Grant. The Queen and the Chancellor had poisoned this woman, not with a single toxin, but with 2, layered, each one reinforcing the other, designed so that treating one would accelerate the other. No standard antidote in the kingdom could have touched it. The Royal Pharmacist Guild, which had been producing fraudulent medicine for years, could not have come close. But ours was not standard. Guildmaster, my voice sounded wrong in the room. Too small, too young. I said it anyway. 2 slow-acting compounds. The labels say Queen Julia and Chancellor Grant. The Guildmaster went still. Then a sound came out of him. Not a word. More like a breath that had been held for days finally leaving his body. "That is what we needed," he said quietly. "That corners them for good." I filed it away. The evidence mattered. The politics mattered. But not to me. Not in that moment. Because I was looking at the woman on the daybed and something in my chest had cracked open. I knew her face. Not from memory. Not from a painting or a letter or a description someone had given me. I knew it the way you know the shape of a door you have been standing outside your entire life without opening. The line of her jaw. The way her hair fell. The specific architecture of a face that had carried me for 9 months and held me for 5 days and then walked into a forest to let me go. "Mom," I said. The word came out before I could stop it. Not calculated, not considered, not the kind of thing I would normally allow myself. It just fell out of my mouth the way water falls when you tip a glass. Gravity, nothing else. The room stopped. The elderly couple turned to look at me. The servants stopped moving. Anna, still holding Layla, stared at me with her mouth open. Gus took a half step forward and then froze, his blunt face cycling through confusion so fast it almost looked like pain. "Adrian, your mother?" Anna's voice was careful, the way she got when the ledger did not add up. Gus said what Gus always said. "What do you mean? What is going on?" I did not answer. I could not, because the only people in the room who had not reacted were the guildmaster, who gave me a small, quiet nod, and the woman on the daybed, who could not react because she was dying. Dolly, she was already beside me. The bottle was in her hand, cork still in, and she held it out to me without being asked. "You and I made this," she said, calm, specific, the way she always was when the formula was right, and the only thing left was to trust the work. "Take 1 breath before you pour." I took the breath. My hands were shaking. I did not hide it. I pulled the cork. The antidote caught the candlelight, clear gold with that faint green thread. I tilted my mother's head with one hand, the way you would hold something that might break, and poured the liquid into her mouth in a slow, steady stream. She swallowed. Once, twice, a third time. I held the bottle still and watched. The color came back to her lips first, a faint warmth spreading from gray to pink, like dawn arriving at the edge of a horizon. Then her cheeks, then her breathing, the ragged, shallow gasps evening out. into something that sounded like rest instead of surrender. I ran the appraisal again. Both compounds, gone, neutralized. The reading was clean. "Guildmaster," I said, "the toxins have cleared." "Good," he said. That single word carried more weight than anything else I had heard him say in 5 years. I was still watching her face when her eyes opened. Her eyes found me immediately. Not the guildmaster, not her parents, not the room full of strangers and children and armored knights. Me. She was weak. Her voice was barely there, thin and cracked from the poison, from the hours of shallow breathing, from whatever she had been carrying long before the toxin reached her. But she said my name. Adrian. Adrian. Not a question, not a guess. She knew who I was. She had known I was alive. She had been waiting. For how long? I could not say yet. But the way she said my name told me it had been every day since the forest. I did not plan what happened next. I had spent 4 chapters of this story, 5 years of my second life, building a voice that noticed things and kept them at a distance. I had processed abandonment once already, in a life that ended on a hospital cot with nobody there. I had decided, somewhere in the quiet of the orphanage kitchen, that I did not need this, that the family I had built was enough, that wanting something you were never given was a kind of weakness I could not afford. All of that held for exactly as long as it took Margaret to lift her hand and place it on the top of my head. Her palm was warm. Her fingers moved through my hair, the way you would touch something you had been dreaming about for 5 years and were afraid would disappear. And I, the reincarnated adult, the careful observer, the boy who had decided not to need this, pressed my face into the blanket beside her shoulder and cried without making a sound. The tears came and I did not stop them. I did not try. There was nothing to calculate, nothing to observe, nothing to file away for later. There was only a hand on my head and a woman saying my name, and I was no longer the orphan who had died alone on a hospital cot, no longer the baby in the basket, no longer the boy who had told himself he did not need a mother. I was just a child, 5 years old, and my mother had said my name. The room was silent around us. Anna stood with Layla against her chest, one hand over her own mouth. Gus had stopped trying to understand and was just watching, his arms at his sides. Dolly had stepped back to give me room, her hands folded in front of her, her eyes bright. Gordon pressed himself against Anna's leg and did not move. The elderly couple, Margaret's parents, my grandparents, people I had not known existed until this moment, held each other and wept without sound. The guildmaster stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed and his jaw set, and if his eyes were wet, he did not acknowledge it. Margaret's hand stayed on my head. She was too weak to hold me. She could barely keep her eyes open, but she did not move her hand, and I did not move my face, and for a time that I could not measure, the room held still around us. I had come to save a stranger. I had saved my mother, and the antidote that did it, the formula Dolly and I had mixed in a shed, with herbs from a forest behind an orphanage nobody in the capital knew existed, was the same one that had saved 4 royal children the week before. The chain of fate had started with a bottle. It ended with a hand on my head. Not ended, begun. Because tomorrow was the throne declaration, and the queen and the chancellor still sat in the palace with their names on the poison inside the woman who had just called me her son. And the brothers who had been searching for me for years were about to walk through a door I had not yet learned to open. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, I stayed where I was. My mother's hand in my hair, the sound of her breathing, even and steady now, the smell of candle wax and old wood and medicine. In my first life, nobody came. In this one, somebody had been waiting all along. The ceiling looked different from the one I had stared at for 5 years. Higher, cleaner, carved in a way that meant somebody with money had cared about what guests saw when they opened their eyes. I sat up. The blanket was heavier than anything the orphanage owned. Gus was asleep on the next bed, with his jaw open, a low, rattling snore rolling out of him every few seconds. Gordon was curled against his shoulder, not quite a pillow and not quite a blanket, but filling the role of both. I had woken too early, the way I always did when something large was waiting. Yesterday had not been a dream. I had walked into a sick room and found a dying woman with ashen skin. I had called her mother before I could stop myself, and she had said my name back. That was the part I could still feel in my chest like a bruise that had not finished forming. She was alive. She was resting down the hall. A soft knock came at the door. 2 taps, then silence. I slid off the bed and padded over barefoot. The Baron stood in the corridor, Margaret's younger brother. My uncle, though neither of us had practiced the word yet. A messenger arrived from the palace, he said quietly. The princes want you there this morning. I did not ask which princes. I knew. Clothes are being prepared at the palace, he added. Come as you are. He waited while I used the washroom. Then I crossed to the women's door and knocked. It opened faster than I expected. Anna was already dressed, hair pulled back, boots on. Behind her, Dolly's face appeared. I have to go to the palace with the Baron, I said. Anna studied me for a half second. She did not ask why, or when I would be back, or whether I was afraid. She simply nodded. Be careful. Dolly disappeared into the room and came back holding a small glass vial with a cork stopper. The amber liquid inside caught the lamplight. Take this. She pressed it into my hand. Strong antidote. I have 2 more, and I can make another batch by tonight if you need it. I wrapped my fingers around the vial. It was warm from her palm. Thank you. She hugged me. Anna hugged me. Neither of them said anything more than that. They stood in the doorway and watched me walk to the stairs, and they were still standing there when I looked back from the landing. That was the thing about the orphanage. They never asked questions when I left at sunrise. They handed me what I needed and stood at the door until I was gone. The carriage rocked gently on the cobblestones. The capital was barely awake. A baker's shutter rose somewhere. A night patrol clattered through a shift change. The Baron sat across from me. You and your friends, he said. You are quite close. They are my family. I said it without thinking, and I did not correct myself. He smiled. It was not a polite smile. It was the kind that comes from watching something you had heard about and finding it true. The princes may be jealous of that bond. I do not think so. Blood has a way of understanding blood, he said. I touched the vial in my pocket. Still there, still warm. Somewhere between the mansion and the palace gates. I made my decisions. I would listen to whatever the brothers had to say. I would answer their questions. I would not pretend the 5 years in Banzas had not happened, and I would not pretend the orphanage was something I could set down now that a palace existed. If they wanted a brother, they could have one. But the family I had built came with me. That was non-negotiable. The carriage stopped. Through the curtain, I could see high stone walls and iron gates already open. Guards in polished armor flanked the entrance. Here we are, the Baron said. I climbed down. The palace was enormous. Decorated corridors stretched in every direction, but there was no time to look. Knights in ceremonial armor formed a corridor of their own, and we moved through it quickly, unseen by anyone who was not supposed to see us. A door opened. 2 young men were already inside. The one on the left had golden blonde hair, the same shade as mine. He stood straight with his hands at his sides, jaw set, eyes locked on me the instant the door opened. The one on the right had silver hair to his jawline, and he was already moving before I finished crossing the threshold. I knew them, not from introductions, from a memory that should have been impossible. I was 5 days old when I last saw them, and I remembered their faces the way you remember a sound that woke you in the night. Not clearly, but enough. Alec, Carter. The names came out of me before I could decide whether to use titles. Carter reached me first. He dropped to one knee so our eyes were level, and then his arms were around me, and his voice was cracking. I am sorry. His hand pressed against the back of my head. I am sorry it took so long. I had spent 5 years building a wall around the part of me that wanted this. It held for about 3 seconds. I wanted to find you, I whispered. Alec crossed the room in 4 steps. He did not kneel. He placed his hand on my shoulder, and the weight of it said everything his voice was too controlled to release. You should not have had to wait, he said. That is on us. Carter let go. His eyes were red. Alec's were not, but his jaw was working the way jaws do when someone is keeping something locked behind their teeth. They sat me down. The Baron excused himself to a side chair, and then Alec told me the truth. They had known I was alive. For years, they had traced the letter our mother left in my basket to the guildmaster in Banzas. They had confirmed I was at the orphanage, and they had chosen not to come for me. The Queen and the Chancellor had agents in every territory, Alec said. His voice was level, precise, the voice of someone who had rehearsed this. If your identity had surfaced at court, you would have been dead within hours. We could not protect you inside these walls. Leaving you in Banzas, hidden, was the only option that kept you alive. I listened. The guild contracts that kept the orphanage funded, the bulk antidote purchases from the military, the adventurers who came through with supplies. Carter counted them on his fingers. That was us, all of it. We could not come to you, so we sent what we could. I did not know whether to thank them or to be furious. I asked the questions that had been sitting in me since the carriage ride. When did you know I was alive? 3 years ago, Alex said. The guildmaster confirmed it through the pendant and the letter. 3 years. I let the number settle. And if I had died there, Neither of them flinched. Carter answered first. Then we would have carried that for the rest of our lives. We knew the risk. We chose it because the alternative was certain. There was a silence. The kind that fills a room when the truth is on the table and nobody is trying to make it smaller than it is. I believed them, not because the logic was clean, because the pain behind it was real. They had not slept well with this decision. That much was visible. The door burst open. Two girls swept in like a weather system. Silver hair, both of them. Same height, same sharp eyes. One had her hair in a neat braid. The other wore hers loose and was already talking before she finished crossing the threshold. Is that him? That is him. The loose-haired one pointed at me. He is tiny. Lillian, you cannot just say that. I am stating a fact, Scarlet. He is tiny and adorable. We were supposed to wait until they finished talking. They look finished. Alec closed his eyes for a single, patient second. Carter rubbed his forehead. Adrian, Carter said, these are your older sisters, Scarlet and Lillian. They are my younger sisters by blood, and your elders by 5 years. Scarlet stepped forward with the expression of someone who had already decided she was going to hug me, whether I consented or not. I am Scarlet. It is very nice to meet you, Adrian. And I am Lillian. We are twins, in case you could not tell. She grinned. Which you absolutely can. I bowed. It was instinct. A small, polite bow of the head, the kind Anna had drilled into me for dealing with adults at the guild. Something about the bow broke both of them. He bowed, Lillian said, as though I had performed a miracle. They were on me before I could react. Arms from both sides, squeezing me between them. A double embrace that compressed my ribs in a way that suggested neither of them had been taught how to hug a person half their size. Can you not? I managed. Absolutely not, Scarlet said. You are ours now, Lillian added. He is suffocating, Alec observed. 2 light knocks landed on the tops of 2 heads. The sisters released me, rubbing the spots where their brothers had delivered judgment, but their smiles did not dim even slightly. They settled on either side of me, and each of them claimed one of my arms. I looked at the 4 of them, 2 brothers who had spent years searching for me in silence, 2 sisters who had decided in the first 30 seconds that I belonged to them. Something inside me, the part that had been calculating what to give and what to hold back, went quiet. Not because the calculation was done, because it had stopped mattering in the way I thought it would. I would accept this, not unconditionally, but with more than I had planned to offer when I walked through the door. Alec outlined the plan. In 3 hours, the nobles would gather in the audience chamber. He would take the oath of kingship. Then, he would name me publicly as the youngest prince, the king's son, his brother. You will wait in the wings, he said. When I call your name, you walk out. That is all you need to do. The twins will behave, Carter added, with the tone of someone issuing a direct order to people who had never followed one. We always behave, Scarlet said. Define always, Alec replied. Yesterday, you tried to commandeer a carriage to the Baron's mansion at midnight, Carter said. That was initiative, not misbehavior. Those are the same thing when it is midnight. I was beginning to understand how this family worked, and I was beginning to think the orphanage and the palace had more in common than either side would admit. The siblings left. The Baron left. 2 servants entered, carrying what looked like enough formal clothing to outfit 3 children my age. Your Highness, we will help you change into your audience attire. I can dress myself. With all respect, Your Highness, you are 5 years old. Please allow us. There was a determination in their eyes that I recognized from Anna when she had decided something was happening whether or not you agreed. I lost that negotiation in under 4 seconds. They stripped me efficiently, put me in undergarments I had never seen before, layered a white shirt and a deep blue formal coat over it, fastened buttons I could not have reached, and adjusted a collar that sat higher than anything I had ever worn. The coat had gold trim along the edges. The boots were polished to a shine that reflected the ceiling. I looked in the mirror. A 5-year-old prince stared back at me. I reached into the old clothes on the chair and transferred the vial to the inside pocket of the new coat. The servants pretended not to notice. The vial sat against my ribs, small and solid. Dolly's work. The only piece of the orphanage I was carrying into that room. Time moved. A servant came to the door and said it was nearly time. I was led through a corridor that ended at a heavy curtain. Beyond it, I could hear the murmur of voices. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Nobles filling the audience chamber. Chairs scraping. Whispered conversations, weaving into a low collective hum. I stood behind the curtain. Through the gap, I could see the edge of the hall. Marble floors. Banners. Armored guards lining the walls. A throne at the far end, empty and waiting. Somewhere in that room, the Queen and the Chancellor were sitting in their seats, believing the ceremony would go their way. My hand found the vial through the coat fabric. Still there, still warm. 3 hours ago, I had been asleep in a borrowed bed. Now, I was standing in the wings of a coronation, wearing a coat that did not belong to me, carrying a bottle of medicine made in a shed. The murmur beyond the curtain grew louder. A horn sounded. The ceremony was beginning. The horn had stopped. The last note hung in the air like a held breath, and then the audience chamber swallowed it. I stood behind the curtain with my hand already in my coat pocket, my fingers wrapped around the glass vial Dolly had given me at dawn. The coat was too big. The collar scratched my neck. The boots were stiff and half a size too large, and I had stuffed cloth into the toes to keep from sliding. A 5-year-old in formal audience dress, standing in the wings of a coronation he was not supposed to survive long enough to witness. Through the gap in the curtain, I could see the audience chamber stretching out in every direction. Polished marble floors, tall arched windows, pouring morning gold across the banners. Rows of nobles in court dress, half of them watching the dais with genuine attention, the other half wearing the careful smiles of people already calculating what the new reign meant for their purse. Armed knights lined the walls. The doors at the far end were open but flanked. Carter had told me that morning that the security detail was triple the standard complement. He had not told me why. He had not needed to. I shifted my weight and pressed my thumb against the cork of the vial, still sealed, still warm from my body heat. Dolly had pressed it into my palm before the sun was fully up, her cat ears flat with worry, and told me to keep it close. She had 2 more at the mansion and enough materials for another batch by evening. I had carried it through the carriage ride, through the dressing, through the rehearsal. I had transferred it to the inside pocket of this ridiculous coat the moment the servants finished buttoning me in. I kept my fingers there now, not because I was afraid, because I had been making medicine long enough to know that the moment you stop expecting the emergency is the moment it arrives. The nobles rose. The chamber went quiet. Alec walked the center aisle like he had been born to it. Golden hair, dark coat with the ceremonial sash across one shoulder, posture straight enough to hang a plumb line from. Carter was half a step behind him, silver-haired, hands clasped behind his back, scanning the gallery the way a soldier scans a tree line. The twins flanked them a pace farther back, Scarlet with her jaw set, Lillian with her chin tilted up. 4 siblings walking into a room that had been rotting from the inside for longer than any of them had been alive. They reached the dais. Alec turned to face the assembly, and the room dropped to silence. Not the quiet of respect, the quiet of people waiting to see which way the wind would blow. He spoke the oath. His voice was level, clear, unrehearsed in a way that made it sound more real than any script could have. He named himself king under kingdom law. He named Carter as first in the line of succession. The words were formal but short. Alec did not decorate them. The assembly answered. Every noble in the chamber raised the acclamation in unison. The sound rolled off the marble and hit the ceiling and came back down like something physical. I watched through the curtain gap. My hand had not left the vial. In the noble gallery, on the raised seats reserved for the Queen's household, Queen Julia sat with her hands folded in her lap and a smile on her face that made my skin crawl. It was the smile of someone watching a chess piece walk into the square she had already marked. She was not nervous. She was not watching the exits. She was watching Alec. Beside her section, at the front of the noble rows, the Chancellor stood with the same expression, thinner, colder, but the same fundamental geometry. 2 people who believed the ceremony was still theirs. I tightened my grip on the vial. The cork pressed into the pad of my thumb hard enough to leave a mark. The acclamation faded. Alec drew a breath to continue. The room held. Something moved in the gallery. The knife came from the noble gallery. I did not see the hand that threw it. I saw the flash, the way light caught the spinning blade for a fraction of a second, and then Alec's arm was up, and the dagger was buried in his forearm, and he staggered back a half step and caught himself on the edge of the throne. The room exploded, nobles screaming, knights drawing steel. Someone in the gallery knocked over a chair, and the crash echoed off the stone. Alec looked at the blade in his arm. He looked at Carter. His voice was tight but controlled. "The blade is poisoned. Close the room." Carter did not hesitate. He turned to the nearest knight captain and gave the order in a voice that cut through the chaos, like a bell through fog. "No one leaves. Seal every door." I heard the heavy doors slam shut, one after another, the locks engaging with a sound like hammer strikes. The screaming dulled to a low roar of confusion and fear, and then Carter's voice punched through it again. "Silence! Stay where you are." I was already moving. The curtain caught my shoulder as I pushed through, and I stumbled, recovered, and ran. 5 strides. That was all the distance between the wings and the dais. Dolly had measured distances like this at the orphanage, pacing off the steps between the work table and the cooling rack, because seconds mattered when a batch was about to turn. I had learned the habit from her. 5 strides, 3 seconds. Alec was sinking. The color had already started draining from his face, faster than it should have been. The same compound class, the same toxin family I had been working against since the orphanage. I knew the speed of it. I knew how many seconds I had before the dose hit the organs. Scarlet, I did not shout. I said her name once, and she was already there, already moving, already dropping to one knee beside Alec. Lift him, shoulders up. She grabbed Alec under the arms and hauled his upper body into a sitting position. Her hands were shaking, but her grip was iron. Lillian, hold his other side. Keep him steady. Lillian locked in beside Scarlet without a word. I had the vial out. The cork came free with a twist of my thumb. The same motion I had done 1,000 times over a work table in a provincial shed, with Dolly correcting my angle and Anna timing the pour. Breathe first, dose second. I do not know where the words came from. Dolly said them every time. I heard them in her voice even now, standing on a marble dais in front of every noble in the kingdom. Breathe first, I said. Dose second. I tilted Alec's head back and poured. The liquid was gold. It smelled like the concentrated extract of everything Dolly and I had built in 5 years of orphanage medicine. It hit his throat and he coughed once, hard, and then his breathing caught and held and steadied. 10 seconds. 20. Color crept back into his face. The lines of pain around his mouth eased. His eyes focused. I held the empty vial in my hand and felt the glass warm against my palm and thought about the fact that 5 years of stirring rods and failed batches and early mornings had compressed into the only motion that mattered. Alec looked at me. His voice was rough. Twice now. I put the empty vial back in my pocket. I am a pharmacist. Saving the person in front of me is my job. Something passed across his face. Not gratitude. Something deeper and harder to name. The expression of a man who had just watched a 5-year-old sprint across a marble floor and save his life with a bottle of medicine mixed in a shed. He rose. Scarlet and Lillian steadied him. Carter was beside them in an instant, jaw locked, fury visible only in the tension of his hands. But Alec was standing. The antidote was working. The king was alive. I knelt beside the dagger. It had fallen from Alec's arm when Scarlet lifted him, and it lay on the marble in a thin smear of blood, the blade still wet. I ran appraisal. The results came up the way they always did, clear and clean and impossible to argue with. Source labels, provenance markers, the toxin's formulation chain, traced backward through every hand that had touched it. 2 names at the top, Queen Julia, Chancellor Grant. I read them aloud, not to the room, to Alec, standing above me, one hand on the throne's armrest to steady himself. But the audience chamber carried sound the way marble carries sound, and every noble in the gallery heard every syllable. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever experienced. Alec stepped forward. His arm was still bleeding through the bandage Scarlet had torn from her sleeve and wrapped around the wound, but his voice was the voice of a king, and no one in that room could pretend otherwise. He named me, son of the late king and the tutor, Margaret of the Lineglide barony, his half-brother, recovered from the orphanage where he had been abandoned at 5 days old. He named the charges: murder of the late queen, his mother, murder of the chancellor's own daughter, Carter's mother, abandonment of a prince of the blood, coordinated poisoning of all 4 royal children, corruption of the Royal Pharmacist Guild, financing a trafficking ring that had been moving orphans through the provincial directors network for years. Every charge landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. I watched the ripples cross the nobles' faces. Some had known, some had suspected, some were hearing it for the first time, and I could see the moment when their expression changed from confusion to comprehension to something cold and permanent. The queen was on her feet before Alec finished. She was screaming, her voice high and shrill, the words tumbling over each other. She called it slander. She called herself the mother of the king. She demanded to be released, to be heard, to be treated as her rank required. The soldiers had already reached her. She fought them the way a person fights when they know the ground is gone, ugly and desperate and too late. Carter turned to the chancellor. The old man had not moved. He stood in the noble row with his hands at his sides and his face composed and said nothing at all, which was somehow worse than the queen's screaming. He simply stood there and waited for the binding. Then he spoke. He called Carter by name. He called himself Carter's grandfather. He asked, in that cold, precise voice, why Carter would do this to him. Carter did not raise his voice. He did not step forward. He stood exactly where he was, silver hair catching the window light, and recited back the words the chancellor had spoken on the day Carter's mother died. The exact words, the cadence, the dismissal. I did not know what those words were, and I did not need to. I watched the Chancellor's face as Carter spoke them, and I watched the moment when recognition landed. The old man's composure did not break. It simply went empty, like a window with the lamp extinguished behind it. He stopped speaking. The soldiers bound him. He did not resist. Alec ordered the simultaneous searches, capital residences, provincial holdings, the guild offices, the orphanage in Banzas. Every location the warrants had been pre-staged for, signed the moment Alec became king. Carter added one more. The Banzas Baron, detained for trafficking. The orphanage director, arrested for running the network under court protection. Children sold, children used, children who had walked out of that orphanage and never come back, and I had never once been told where they went. I stood on the dais with an empty vial in my pocket and blood on the marble and the names of people who had tried to kill my family hanging in the air, and I felt something settle in my chest that I did not have a word for. Not satisfaction, not revenge, something quieter and harder and more final. The wrong that started on the day I was born had been named in front of everyone who needed to hear it. The soldiers led the bound prisoners out. The doors opened and closed and opened again, and the audience chamber gradually stopped vibrating with the aftermath. What remained was half a room of nobles, some pale, some shaking, most staring at the dais with the expression of people who had just watched the floor rearrange itself under their feet. Alec spoke to them. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He told them the truth, that the kingdom had been hollowed out, that the corruption they had just witnessed arrested was the symptom of a disease that went deeper than two people, that the nobility had allowed it because it was easier to collect the queen's favors than to question them. Carter picked it up without pause. He said that their father's incompetence had opened the door, that the queen and the chancellor had walked through it, and that the people in this room had held it open. He said it was over. Then both of them bowed. Alec first, Carter beside him, heads low, asking the remaining nobles for their strength in rebuilding what had been destroyed. A king and a prince, bowing to the people they had just stripped of their illusions. I did not know they were going to do that. I looked at Scarlett and Lillian and saw the same surprise on their faces, and then, without anyone saying a word, all three of us bowed too. 5 siblings, lined up on the dais, heads down. The chamber was silent for 3 seconds. Then someone in the back of the gallery called out the acclamation, and the whole room followed, louder than before, louder than the first time. A sound that shook the banners and filled the stone and did not stop. I raised my head and stood there in an oversized blue coat with an empty vial in my pocket and the taste of adrenaline still in my throat. And I listened to a room full of strangers cheer for a family I had not known existed until 3 days ago. It was, without exaggeration, the strangest moment of both my lives. Alec told me to go back to the mansion, rest, eat, come to the palace in the morning. He said it like an order and meant it like a request, and I could see the exhaustion underneath the formality. His arm was bandaged properly now, the antidote doing its work, and he had a kingdom to begin running before sunrise. I did not argue. What I had not expected was that Scarlett and Lillian would announce, in the tone of people who have already decided and are informing you as a courtesy, that they were coming with me. They refused to be separated from their newest brother on his first night as a publicly named prince. Carter sighed. Alec did not bother trying to stop them. They climbed into the carriage before I did. The Line Glide mansion was lit up when we arrived. The front door opened before the carriage stopped, and Anna was standing there with her arms crossed, reading the situation in one glance the way she always did. She looked at me. She looked at the 2 princesses stepping down behind me. She uncrossed her arms. "Dinner is ready," she said. "Sit down." That was Anna. The kingdom had just changed hands, and she had set a table. Inside, the first thing I did was find my grandfather. He was standing in the hallway with his wife beside him, and they both had the look of people who had heard what happened at the ceremony, but had not yet fully believed it. I stopped in front of them. "May I call you grandfather?" I asked. "And grandmother?" He said yes before I finished the sentence. His voice cracked on the word, and he turned away for a moment, and his wife put her hand on his arm, and they both nodded. And that was that. It cost me nothing to ask. It cost them everything to hear. Dinner was chaos. Dolly had claimed the seat to my left before anyone else reached the table, and the moment Scarlett sat down across from her, the air changed. Dolly introduced herself with the calm precision of someone stating a legal fact. "I am Adrian's older sister. I have been looking after him since he was a baby." Scarlett's eyebrows went up. "We are his blood-related older sisters by 5 years. I have been raising him since before he could hold a stirring rod." Dolly's ears went flat. That was her combat stance. Lillian leaned across the table. "We are princesses, and I am the person who taught him how to make the medicine that saved your brother's life today." Dolly did not blink. The silence at the table lasted exactly 1.5 seconds. Then, both sides started talking at once, and the argument escalated with the speed and precision of a chemical reaction that had been waiting for a catalyst. Scarlet invoked blood. Dolly invoked proximity. Lillian invoked royal protocol. Dolly invoked 4 years of shared bathwater and burned fingers over a cauldron. Anna set her fork down. The sound was not loud. It did not need to be. "Sit down, eat." Everyone sat, everyone ate, for approximately 30 seconds. Then Layla, who had been quietly sitting on my right with her legs dangling off the chair because she was 3 and the chair was built for adults, wrapped both arms around my elbow and pressed her face against my sleeve. "I am Adrian's little sister," she announced, and the room dissolved. Gus laughed so hard he knocked his cup over. Gordon, who had been asleep under the table, startled awake and made a noise that was half growl and half yawn, and Lillian reached down to scratch behind his ears and forgot she was supposed to be arguing. Scarlet tried to maintain her position and failed when Dolly offered her a taste of the herb bread she had made that afternoon, and Scarlet's expression betrayed her the moment the flavor landed. I sat at the center of it. My mother was resting in the next room, recovering. My twin sisters were on one side. The orphanage family was on the other. A bear cub was asleep against my boot. The guildmaster had sent word that the Banza's director was in custody, and the orphanage was being searched. The children's things would be retrieved by morning. This was not the life I had been preparing myself for. In my previous life, I had prepared for quiet rooms and empty tables, and the sound of a clock in a building where no one was coming. I had gotten very good at that preparation. I had made it a skill, the way other people made cooking a skill or music a skill. The skill of being alone and calling it enough. I looked at the table, at the candles, at Dolly's ears, which had finally unflattened, at Scarlet, who was pretending she had not just complimented the bread, at Layla, still attached to my arm, eyes closed, breathing steady, small enough to fit in my lap. I was going to have to learn a different skill. We filed through the side corridor, and the applause followed us through the stone like it belonged to another life. Then we turned the corner and stopped. She was there, my mother, sitting in a wheelchair at the end of the hall, clapping slowly, deliberately, as though she had timed her arrival to the exact moment the doors closed behind us. Mother, the word left me before I chose it. Alec and Carter said it differently, together, the way two people do when they have called someone the same name for a decade. Teacher. She should not have been upright. 2 days ago, she was dying on a gurney. The antidote had done more than I promised, but the wheelchair and the color in her cheeks and the fact that she was smiling were things no formula accounted for. She spoke to the brothers first, quietly, the way a teacher speaks when the room already belongs to her, regardless of crowns. She told them they had grown into everything she hoped. 6 years of silent work, she said. 6 years of carrying what had been done to their family, and they bore it without breaking. She placed her hand on each of their heads in turn, the way she must have done when they were children, and said she had nothing left to teach. Alec knelt. The king of 2 days dropped to one knee and took her hand, and his jaw was the only thing holding his face together. Carter knelt beside him, eyes red, hands gripping hers like a boy half his age. She turned to the twins. She told them their conduct in the chamber had been brave, but not ladylike, and suggested further instruction in composure. She said the kingdom would be watching its princesses, and she expected better posture. Scarlet and Lillian deflated in perfect unison. We laughed, even Alec. Then she looked at me. Adrian, come here. 5 steps, the longest of either life. She pulled me in. Her heartbeat was steady and warm and real against my ear, and she smelled like chamomile and clean linen, and something under that which I could not name, but which my body recognized before my mind did. She said I had done well. She said I had saved Alec. She said I had given him the courage to stand again. I buried my face in her shoulder and cried. I do not know how long. A minute, maybe 2. Long enough for the tension of 48 hours to drain out of me like water from a cracked jar. Alec and Carter and the twins gathered around us, hands on my back and hair and shoulders, and I was wrapped in more warmth than I had ever felt while conscious. When I pulled back, my face was a mess, and I did not care. Alec spoke first. He would no longer call her teacher. He would call her mother, because that was what she had always been. Carter said she had been his anchor since his own mother died. Scarlet observed with perfect logic that since Margaret was my birth mother and I was their blood brother, the arithmetic simply worked. Lillian said she had always wanted a mother and was glad it was this one. Margaret beckoned them all closer, both hands open. She gathered Alec, Carter, Scarlet, and Lillian against her and the chair, pressing them close with arms that should not have had the strength but did. So many children, all at once. Her voice was barely a whisper. I am the luckiest mother alive. She did not rank them. She did not separate blood from bond. She held them all as though they were the same thing, because to her, they were. I love every one of you, she said. All of you. I stood a step back and watched. The brothers who searched for me for 5 years. The sisters who adopted me in a single afternoon. The woman forced to leave me in a forest who had spent every day since regretting it. They were all crying, even Alec. Something in my chest that I had carried since my first life, heavy and nameless and older than either body, loosened. Not gone, loosened. Like a knot pulled too tight for so long, the rope forgot what slack felt like. Alec told Margaret to return to the mansion. She conceded with the grace of a woman who had already won the important argument. I volunteered to monitor her. She pretended to cry about her newly reunited son being cruel. We laughed. Alec asked me to come to the palace tomorrow morning. Plans, the future, no rush. We did not have to hide anymore. Scarlett and Lillian volunteered to escort us to the Line Glide mansion. Alec approved. The palace would be chaos for days. Soldiers searching noble houses. Corrupt officials being processed. Better to keep the family concentrated where guards could protect everyone. I asked about continuing potion work. Alec said he would appreciate it. I said I would keep going. Sitting idle had never suited me. Margaret could walk with a cane, so the wheelchair was folded onto the carriage. The twins climbed in with field trip enthusiasm. I climbed in last and watched the palace shrink behind us. The parlor was full. Anna had kept the household running because Anna always kept everything running. The orphanage family and the grandparents were waiting. Welcome back, Anna said. I am home. I explained everything. The ceremony, the arrests, the public naming. I told them I was apparently a prince, that I had no idea what came next except that hiding was over. Layla nodded seriously. Then came introductions. Dolly said her name and added, with deliberate emphasis, that she was my older sister. The temperature dropped. Scarlett introduced herself as my blood-related older sister, Lillian echoed. Both stressed the word blood. Dolly's ears flattened. Scarlett's chin rose. The air crackled. That is enough. Anna stepped between them. Adrian has had a long day. All three looked at me. I was making a face that said, please stop. Layla flew across the room, attached herself to my arm, and announced she was my little sister, and it was not negotiable. The war ended. Nobody could compete. The guildmaster arrived, confirmed the orphanage was sealed as a crime scene, and took Anna, Gus, and Dolly to retrieve belongings with a night escort. I turned to the grandfather. May I call you grandfather? His face broke open like sunrise. Of course, he said. His eyes went wet. He looked away and pretended he had something in them. We saw them off. Beside me, the twins discovered Gordon. Scarlett buried her hands in his fur. Lillian took the other side. Gordon's expression was the particular helplessness of a bear cub being loved too aggressively by two determined princesses. I told them to stop before they traumatized him. They complied slowly. Gordon fled behind two older orphanage children and peered at the twins with the wariness of a creature who had survived something. I was exhausted. But announcing tiredness in this room would trigger a lap pillow competition. I lacked the skills to arbitrate. I'm going to check on my mother, I said, and slipped away. Layla materialized beside me. Layla is coming too. Fine. Layla was always acceptable. The mansion was large enough that I got lost twice before the grandmother found us in a hallway and led us by the hand. My mother was on a sofa by the window, drinking tea. Her color was better. Her eyes were clear. She looked like a woman who had decided to be alive and was making the most of it. I sat beside her. Layla claimed the other side. The grandmother took the armchair across from us. I appraised my mother, not with words, with magic. The toxin was gone. The antidote had finished its work, but there was something the antidote could not reach. A mild paralysis along her right side. Her hand moved slowly. Her hip favored one direction. The poison had left its mark even after leaving. Mother, you still have numbness on your right side. She looked at me with surprise that was not about the diagnosis. A little, she admitted. Much better, but yes, I can heal it with magic. Two sets of wide eyes, two mouths forming the same small circle. In this world, humans and beastmen could not use magic. It was categorical in the way fish did not climb trees. I was an exception nobody had classified, and I intended to keep it that way. But she was my mother, and she was carrying damage I could remove, and I was not going to let a classification problem stop me. I placed my hand on her shoulder. The recovery spell produced a pale blue light, soft and clean, spreading from my palm through her skin. I moved to her hip, then her knee, 3 points where the paralysis had settled. Try moving your right hand, she lifted it, turned it, closed her fingers, and opened them smoothly, without the hitch that had been there for weeks. She did not cry. She placed her hand on top of my head and held it there, warm and steady, and said nothing for a long moment. I had healed people before with potions. This was different. This was my mother's hand on my head, and the knowledge that I had given it back to her. Layla beamed beside me, unsurprised. She had seen me use magic before and considered it unremarkable. The grandmother asked if that had been real. I told her it was basic recovery magic. I asked her to keep it quiet. She agreed immediately. So did the maid, who had seen everything from the doorway. The exhaustion hit all at once. The spell, the morning, the week. "Come here," my mother said, and patted her lap. I lay down. Layla claimed the other side before the cushion stopped moving. My mother's hand moved through my hair in slow, even strokes. Her other hand rested on Layla's small back. "Sleep, Adrian. Sleep, Layla." The last thing I felt was her hand on my head, steady and warm. In my first life, nobody was there when I fell asleep. In this one, she was. The difference was everything. When Layla and I came downstairs, unhappy faces waited. The twins had spent the whole time looking for us. Gordon had spent the whole time fleeing the twins. Margaret followed us down and explained I had been tired from the early morning. The mood turned when Scarlett studied Margaret's movements. "Mother, you look so much better." Margaret said I had treated the paralysis. She did not mention how. My secret stayed where it was. Then Gordon happened. He had been hovering at the group's edge with the cautious longing of a bear cub who wanted to be petted, but feared being petted too hard. He shuffled closer, stopped, shuffled closer. "Mother," his voice was the smallest a bear his size could manage. "May I come sit with you?" She opened her arm. "Of course, come here." He climbed onto the sofa, and the moment her hand touched his head, every muscle went slack. His eyes went soft and half closed. His whole body radiated the specific contentment of a creature that had found exactly what it was looking for. The room melted. The orphanage children had all started calling her mother. It happened without announcement. Anna used the formal address, because Anna did everything formally. But Dolly, Gus, Layla, Gordon, all of them said mother. My mother had gone from one child she was forced to abandon to more than she could count on both hands. She was sitting on a sofa with a bear cub melting against her hip and a 3-year-old demon child who had flown back onto the last patch of lap. And she was smiling the way people smile when they receive something they stopped believing was possible. The grandfather pretended to read. The grandmother did not pretend. She dabbed her eyes and let the tears fall. Layla won the lap competition, fastest and smallest. The laws of physics were on her side, and nobody could challenge physics. The grandmother said from her chair that the mansion had never been this loud, and she did not mind one bit. That evening, I lay in a bed too large for me, in a room too large for me, in a house full of people who had decided I was theirs. Gordon was on the rug. He had followed me upstairs without being asked and settled with the certainty of a creature who had done this 100 times. His breathing was already slow. Down the hall, my mother was resting. The twins were in a guest suite. Anna had returned with the belongings and organized the unloading in under an hour. Dolly had unpacked her herb kits first. Gus had been told he was starting etiquette lessons at the palace and had not taken the news well. Tomorrow, I would go to the palace. There would be meetings. The pharmacist guild needed rebuilding. The kingdom needed a supply chain. And somewhere in the middle, a 5-year-old with a grown man's memory would have to figure out where he fit. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, my mother's hand was the last thing my memory offered. The steady warmth of it on my head, the smell of chamomile and clean linen. In my first life, I fell asleep in a hospital and nobody was there. In this one, everyone was. I closed my eyes and let the difference carry me under. Gordon snored once from the rug. It was the best sound I had ever heard. Anna and the others came back from the sealed orphanage that evening with everything we owned. 2 bags. One of them was mostly potion equipment. The grandfather watched us carry them in, and I saw the exact moment it registered. His grandson had spent 5 years on Earth with possessions that fit in a single trip. He put his hand on my head and did not say anything, but his face said everything a mouth could not. The twins went quiet. Even Scarlett, who had never missed a meal in her life, looked at the pile of hand-me-down tunics and understood something she had only read about in books. Margaret redirected the table before anyone could drown in it. The cooks prepared a wonderful meal. Let us eat before it gets cold. She had been a teacher long enough to know when to let a moment land and when to move everyone past it. The twins obeyed. Layla shoved meat into her mouth and grinned at me with sauce on both cheeks. I wiped her face, said nothing, and thought about how many hungry kids in this kingdom had nobody to wipe anything. That night, Gordon caused a small crisis by being too soft. Everyone wanted to sleep next to him. The twins campaigned openly. Layla staked a claim. Even Dolly, who normally stayed out of disputes, was eyeing the bear cub with intent. Margaret settled it by claiming Gordon herself, which made the twins wail and Gordon exhale with visible relief. The day's petting marathon had left him shell-shocked. Layla grabbed my arm and announced she was sleeping with me. The matter was closed before anyone could object. Gus, meanwhile, sat with the grandfather and talked about nothing in particular, completely unbothered by the politics of bedtime. The next morning, I went to the palace. Alec had called a meeting with the full cabinet, and I was the last seat to fill. The room was full of people who looked like they could end careers with a single memo. Alec introduced them as the new cabinet, a mix of holdovers and replacements. Carter waved me to the chair beside him. I sat, tried to look like I belonged, and listened. The briefing was immediate and absurd in equal measure. The Queen had been planning a war with the neighboring kingdom to consolidate power after the coronation. The Chancellor, hedging his bets, had been preparing to sell the country outright if her plan failed. Two people at the top of the same government, pulling in opposite directions, and neither of them had noticed the other. They had not been governing. They had been scheming, and the machinery of the kingdom had rusted around them while they played their separate chess games against each other. Alec laid out the priorities: military reform for stability, public works to create jobs, food distribution for the slums, tax reform, carefully phased to avoid collapse. Carter turned to me with a look that was half apology. He explained that the public announcement of my royal reinstatement would create a moment, and that moment needed to be used. He wanted me to run charity kitchens, soup, free healing, and a visible royal presence among the people the old regime had abandoned. I am happy to do it, I told him. But let me suggest two things. Bring officials to record what the citizens tell us, and run street cleanup at the same time. It builds trust, and it lets us see what is actually broken. Carter raised an eyebrow. Alec nodded slowly. Several cabinet members wrote that down. I had been doing the same thing at the orphanage for years, listening to adventurers about what worked and what did not. The scale was different. The principle was identical. They also confirmed my succession rank, second in line after Carter, and they had prepared a suite of rooms for me in the royal wing. I was formally a palace resident now. Back at the mansion, I was introduced to Martha. She was a rabbit beast woman, newly of age, assigned as my personal attendant, and she was from our orphanage. Anna recognized her in the doorway, and they both froze with their mouths open, which was the first time I had ever seen Anna surprised by anything. Martha had been at the orphanage years before any of us arrived, and Anna was the only one old enough to remember her. "If Martha is looking after you," Anna said, once the shock wore off, "then I am completely at ease." Martha beamed. Then she spotted Gordon, and her fingers started twitching. I had seen this reaction before. Every person who encountered Gordon for the first time went through the same sequence: the double take, the softening expression, the involuntary hand movement. Within 30 seconds, she was stroking his head with the kind of bliss that only freshly bathed bear cub fur could produce. Gordon tolerated it with the dignity of someone who had long since accepted his role in the world. In the workshop, Dolly and Anna had been making potions all morning. I joined them. Margaret brought the twins down to watch, and they were fascinated. Scarlett asked about every step. Lillian wanted to know why the leftover herbs were not thrown away. "We eat them," I said. "After extraction, they absorb flavor instead of bitterness. The orphanage cook used to make stir-fry with them." Margaret suggested the mansion chef try something with the leftovers. That evening, the extracted herbs came back as a soup so good that Layla declared it the best thing she had ever tasted, which she said about most things, but this time meant it. Training started the next day. Margaret was the instructor, which should not have surprised me as much as it did. She had been the royal tutor for 2 princes. Of course, she could teach swordwork, etiquette, and magic theory. The woman's range was terrifying. We lined up in the garden with practice swords. Mine was dagger-sized because I was 5. Layla grabbed a matching one and stood beside me, copying everything I did. Margaret walked the line. Anna and Dolly earned immediate praise. Gordon, low to the ground with a bear's natural center of gravity, was impossibly stable. Gus, on the other hand, was a disaster. "Your swing is all arm," Margaret told him. She pushed him with the flat of her practice sword, and he toppled like a badly stacked crate. "If a real opponent did that, you would be dead before you hit the ground." Then came the flexibility check. Margaret asked Gus to do a forward fold. He got approximately nowhere. His body was so rigid that Layla started laughing. Anna shoved his back without mercy. "Lie down," Margaret said pleasantly. Gus obeyed. She placed her hands on his spine. "Breathe in. Now out." The sound that came next was somewhere between a thunderclap and a walnut being cracked by a horse. Gus made a noise I had never heard a person make. Margaret worked her way down his back with the precision of someone dismantling a faulty mechanism. Each correction punctuated by a bone-deep pop and a yelp from Gus that echoed across the garden. By the end, he was twitching on the grass with his eyes rolled back, and Margaret was calmly announcing that this would be a daily routine until his body cooperated. Anna asked to learn the technique. Nobody else said a word. We all privately vowed to stretch every morning for the rest of our lives. After Gus was scraped off the lawn, Margaret brought out a monocrystal, a small transparent sphere that glowed when someone with magical ability held it. We passed it around. It lit up for me, Dolly, Layla, and the elf twins. Dolly stared at the glow in her hands with wide eyes. Beastmen were supposed to have no magic. The crystal did not care about that. "You are blessed," Margaret told her quietly. Dolly cried, and it was the good kind. Gus's crystal stayed dark, but he did not seem bothered. He was too busy trying to remember how his spine worked. Then Gordon's mallet caught him square during sparring practice and sent him skidding across the garden. "Do not apologize," Anna told Gordon. "If he cannot dodge a bear cub, he cannot dodge anything." Gus lay on the ground and stared at the sky. It had been a very long morning for him, and it was not yet 9 o'clock. 3 days later, we opened the first soup kitchen at a church near the slums. By then, the daily routine had solidified into something almost normal. Mornings, training, body correction for Gus, magic circulation practice, etiquette drills. Afternoons, potion production. Evenings, the kind of dinner where Layla tried to sit on everyone's lap simultaneously, and Gordon hid behind furniture to avoid being petted. Somewhere in there, Bard and Lena visited with Wolf. They brought herbs from adventurer contacts, enough to keep our production going. Margaret met them and gripped their hands so hard she left marks. These were the people who had found me in a forest basket. There was not enough gratitude in any language for that. The kitchen itself was chaos, made functional. Anna ran the queue. Gus and Gordon handled crowd flow. Scarlett and Lillian served soup. Margaret listened to the citizens who came through, writing their problems on sheets of parchment with handwriting so precise it could have been printed. I ladled soup and tried not to think about what I was seeing. These were not just hungry people. Many were refugees, driven out of southern territories by the taxes the Chancellor had rubber-stamped for years. Entire families had walked north because their land could no longer feed them. I had been preparing for hunger as an abstract policy problem, and the abstraction had just lined up in front of me for stew. 2 new faces joined us that day. Stella, Alex's fiancé, arrived with a magic detection ability that let her spot a forged guild token in the queue before anyone else noticed. Tina, Carter's fiancé, went straight to the healing tent and started working alongside Dolly without being asked. Layla bounced between the tent and the serving line, using her recovery magic on anyone who needed it, grinning so hard that grown men twice her height could not help grinning back. No government officials showed up. They had been assigned to record citizen complaints, take down names and addresses, catalog the specific needs of each district. None of them came. The guards assigned to protect us were visibly annoyed. I made a note and kept ladling. Maybe there was a reason, maybe there was not. We would find out at the next kitchen. The second kitchen ran 2 days later, at a site further south. More people came. Still, no officials. Anna stopped pretending she was not furious. Gus said he wanted to storm the palace. Margaret smiled, which was worse than any threat either of them could make, and said we would visit the palace after cleanup. She left the twins at home specifically because she did not want anyone punching a bureaucrat. She brought me. Carter was in his office. He already knew. The guards had reported it. He stood, apologized, and explained. The officials had not come because their supervisor had ordered them to falsify attendance reports instead. The man had bet that royals would never actually visit the charity sites because for 2 generations, royals never had. He had been reading from an old playbook, and Margaret had burned the playbook by simply showing up. Carter suspended the supervisor on the spot. Documentation seizure, formal misconduct charges, immediate removal from post. I stood there in a formal coat that was still too big for me and watched a 5-year-old's afternoon outing become the first prosecution of the new reign. I made a private decision, standing in that office, that I would personally attend every kitchen for the rest of my life. Not because it was policy, because the moment you stop showing up is the moment someone starts writing fiction on your behalf. The weeks folded into each other after that. Stella and Tina became fixtures at the household table. Stella had a quiet way of noticing things, as if her magic detection extended to reading rooms. Tina worked with Dolly in the lab and never needed to be told what to do next. They were not visitors. By the second week, they were family, the way all our family worked, by doing the work and sitting at the table afterward. Margaret was walking unaided by then. Whatever I had healed in her at the mansion had held. She ran the household, ran the training, ran the etiquette lessons, ran the soup kitchens, and somehow still found time to sit with Layla in the evenings and teach her letters. The woman operated on a schedule that would have killed a lesser person. Then Alec called us to the palace for an official meeting. The succession was formally set. Carter first, me second, Scarlet third, Lillian fourth. The trial of the Queen and the Chancellor was confirmed for 1 week out, and we would all be required to attend. I did not sleep well that night. The trial meant sitting in a courtroom and watching the people who had ordered my abandonment answer for it. Not in the abstract, not in a story someone told me later, but in the same room, close enough to see their faces. I had known this was coming. Knowing did not make it smaller. I stayed up past the hour I should have. Then I got out of bed and walked down the corridor to Margaret's room. She was awake. She had been waiting. I do not think she expected me to come. I think she hoped I would. We did not say much. She pulled me onto her lap and held me the way she had started holding me since the mansion, with one arm across my back and her chin resting on top of my head. I could feel her heartbeat. It was steady. I fell asleep against her shoulder. I woke up the next morning in my own bed and could not remember being carried. The blanket was tucked around me the way she did it, tight at the shoulders and loose at the feet, and Gordon was snoring on the rug. Tomorrow was the trial. The people who broke this family apart would stand in a room full of the people they broke. I was 5 years old, and I was ready. The day of the trial came the way most heavy things do, quietly. We dressed in our formal clothes without saying much. Margaret checked every collar and every cuff, like we were going to a portrait sitting, not to watch two people be told they were going to die. The carriage ride was silent. Layla and the others stayed home with Martha and Anna. This was not for them. The streets outside the window moved in that slow way a city moves when it knows something is happening, but has not been told what. The military base sat at the edge of the capital, fortified beyond anything the public ever saw. Alec had chosen it deliberately. If anyone tried to rescue the Queen or the Chancellor, the building could withstand an assault. The precaution was almost certainly unnecessary. Nobody was coming for either of them, but procedure had been the entire point of this new reign, and so procedure applied. Inside, the reception room smelled like iron and old stone. Alec was already there with Carter. He stood when we entered and briefly outlined the schedule. The Queen's trial in the morning, the Chancellor's trial in the afternoon. The judge would handle almost everything. We would sit behind the bench in an elevated gallery, hidden by a partition wall. The defendants could see the judge. They could not see us. Today is mostly watching, Alec said. He looked at each of us, and his eyes stopped on the twins for a beat longer than necessary. If at any point you need to leave, leave. Nobody will think less of you. Margaret touched his arm once. That was all. I sat in my chair, adjusted the coat that was slightly too large for a 5-year-old, and waited. The courtroom was built to make people feel small. High ceilings, gray stone, no decoration. The judge's bench sat at the center, elevated. Behind and above it, our gallery. Below and in front, the defendant's box. Soldiers lined every wall. They brought her in shackled, and I barely recognized her. The last time I had seen Queen Julia, she had been in silk and gold with her hair in elaborate braids. The woman they led into the courtroom wore prisoner's clothes. Her hair was tangled. Her skin had gone sallow from weeks without sunlight, but her eyes had not changed. She glared at the judge the way you glare at an insect that has landed on something you own. The judge read the charges. His voice was even and unhurried. Orchestration of over 100 murders across 2 decades. Attempted murder of all 4 royal children. Abandonment of the late king's youngest son in a forest on his 5th day of life. Financing of a trafficking ring through the orphanage director in Banzas. Corruption of the Royal Pharmacist Guild, resulting in further mass deaths from degraded medicines across every territory the guild supplied. That was me, the youngest son, the one left in the forest. I sat in my gallery chair and listened to the list of what had been done to me read out in a voice that sounded like a man reading inventory figures. The Queen did not deny the charges. She refused the court's authority entirely. She declared that she was this kingdom's queen and that no court had the standing to judge her. She demanded a new law be written immediately, exempting all royalty and nobility from criminal prosecution. The judge explained, with the patience of a man who had prepared for exactly this, that no such exemption existed in the kingdom's legal code, that even if one were drafted, laws could not be applied retroactively under the Constitution, that her title did not place her above the law and never had. She did not hear him, or she heard him and could not absorb it. In my past life, I had met people like this, the kind who had never once been told no in a way that actually took. They did not process refusal. They did not argue against it so much as refuse to acknowledge the reality in which it existed. The queen was not defending herself. She was insisting the courtroom was not real. She escalated. She screamed that the court release her immediately. She screamed that she was being held illegally. The judge continued reading the evidence summary. She screamed over him. He did not raise his voice. He simply waited for each burst to end and resumed from where he had stopped. The soldiers on either side of her gripped the restraining cords and held her in the chair. The judge noted that the defendant had received a deviant upbringing that the court did not dismiss, but that the crimes she had personally directed, and in some cases, personally carried out, were too severe and too numerous for any mitigating factor to reduce the sentence. The motive in every case had been private gain. The body count exceeded 100 confirmed deaths. The Pharmacist Guild alone, starved of funding and staffed with bribed incompetence under her directive, had produced medicines so degraded that entire regions went undertreated for years. She was still screaming when the sentence came. The judge said the words with the same measured cadence he had used for everything else: the death sentence. The queen did not stop. She was dragged from the courtroom in full restraints, still screaming, her voice getting smaller as the corridor swallowed it. Scarlett exhaled. It came out of her like she had been holding a single breath for the entire morning. Lillian closed her eyes and leaned back in her chair. Carter stared at the empty defendant's box. Alec did not move. He sat perfectly still, with his hands flat on the armrest. I looked at my oldest brother's shoulders and understood something I had not understood before. He was 17. He had just watched his own mother be sentenced to death by a court he had built, and he had not flinched. And the cost of not flinching was something I could see from 4 feet shorter and 50 feet behind him. We did not speak to Alec. We let him be. Lunch was laid out in the reception room between the trials. Nobody ate. Scarlett and Lillian, who normally could match the orphanage crew plate for plate, had left more than half their food untouched. I could not blame them. The morning had taken something out of all of us that food could not put back. "Today is hard," Margaret said. "You do not need to force it." The twins set down their forks without argument. Margaret watched them for a moment, then looked at Carter. Something passed between them that did not require words. "Both of you." Carter leaned forward and spoke to the twins directly. "The afternoon trial is the Chancellor. He is your grandfather. If you want to sit this one out, nobody will question it." The Chancellor was their grandfather. He was Carter's grandfather too. The man who had murdered their mother. The man who had murdered Carter's mother, because she was the same woman. They had all lost the same person to the same man, and now they were being asked whether they wanted to watch him answer for it. Scarlett looked Carter in the eye without wavering. "I will be there." Lillian lifted her chin. "He was family. That is exactly why I have to see it." Carter studied them for a long moment, then reached over and placed a hand on each of their heads. He did not say anything else. He went back to his chair. Margaret and Alec exchanged a glance and a small nod. The twins would hold. They had already decided, and the decision itself was the proof. I had not been asked, so I reached over and took Carter's hand. He looked down at me. I did not explain. He closed his fingers around mine, and we sat like that until the steward came to tell us it was time. The afternoon trial was a different animal. They brought Chancellor Grant in, and the first thing I noticed was the silence. The Queen had entered screaming. The Chancellor entered like a man walking to a desk. His hair was lank, his skin grayed from detention, but his posture was upright and his expression was nothing. Not calm, not defiant, simply empty, the way a closed ledger is empty. The judge read the indictment: high treason through secret dealings with the Empire. The Empire's own arrests had confirmed the documents beyond dispute. Murder of his daughter, the king's consort, the mother of Carter, Scarlett, and Lillian. Murder of multiple women in his own household who had become pregnant and were then erased. Orchestration of the Pharmacist Guild corruption. Financing of the trafficking ring through the Banza's orphanage. Margaret held the twins against her. Scarlett was crying without sound, her face pressed into Margaret's shoulder. Lillian's tears ran in straight lines, and she did not wipe them. Carter's hand had gone rigid in mine, The judge asked the defendant if he had anything to say regarding the charges. The chancellor said, in a tone that could have been discussing weather, that he was well aware of his own crimes. He had committed them deliberately. Anyone who had threatened his hold on power had been eliminated because that was what power required. He did not apologize. He said the word apologize the way someone says irrelevant. He confirmed the empire connection without hesitation, adding only that the empire's nobles had been disappointingly easy to catch. The queen had at least believed her own delusions. She had lived inside a world where she was above consequence, and when that world collapsed, she had collapsed with it. The chancellor believed nothing. He had known exactly what he was doing, had done the arithmetic on every life he ended, and had filed each one under acceptable cost. He was not a person who had lost control. He was a person who had never needed it because calculation had served him perfectly until the day it had not. The judge noted the defendant's pattern of paranoid governance, the systematic elimination of anyone perceived as a threat, and the decades of unchecked authority that had enabled it. The sentence was the same: death. The chancellor closed his eyes when the judge said it, not a flinch, a notation. He had heard the number and filed it. The judge asked if he had any final words. He said he had none. He said he was tired of the questioning and would like to be done. He was let out. He did not look at the gallery. He did not look at anything. The soldiers walked him through the door and the courtroom was empty again. Carter squeezed my hand once, hard, and let go. Scarlett and Lillian cried into Margaret's dress without making a sound. Alec closed his eyes the same way he had closed them that morning, and I realized it was not composure. It was the only way he could hold himself together in a room full of people who needed him to hold himself together. We left the courtroom in silence. Back in the reception room, we sat in the leather chairs and did not move. Someone had laid out tea. Nobody touched it. The silence was the kind that fills a space after something irreversible has happened, and nobody knows the first sentence that comes after. Between the two trials and folded into the indictment, the trafficking case had been presented in supplementary testimony. The orphanage director in Banzas, arrested the day after the coronation, had given a full account under questioning. The older children who had disappeared each spring during my years at the orphanage had been traced to a series of holding houses along the empire border. A joint guild and military operation in the weeks since the coronation had recovered the first group, 14 children. The oldest was 16. The youngest was 8. I had watched those older kids leave every spring in a cart. I was told they had been placed with families or apprenticed to trades. I was too young to question it, and by the time I was old enough to wonder, the pattern was just part of the orphanage's rhythm. They left, they did not come back. I told myself that was normal. It was not normal. They had been on a road I did not know about, and my work in the capital had finally pulled them off it. They were alive. That was the part I held on to. Alive and in need of something the state orphanage system could not provide, because the state orphanage system was the machinery that had failed them in the first place. I asked Alec, before the chancellor's verdict was read, to route the recovered children to a guarded healing house under household supervision, not back to a government orphanage, not into a system that had let a trafficking ring operate for a decade without anyone noticing or caring. Alec signed the order without hesitation. Margaret nodded once. Carter said nothing, but his jaw was tight enough that I could see the muscle in his cheek. The children I had lived alongside and never been able to protect were coming to a place I could reach. That did not fix what had happened to them, but it was the first step towards something that was not abandonment, and I knew what the absence of that step felt like. Margaret waited until we were home. The small dining room in the East Wing had been set for dinner. The table was round, not long. The candles were lit and the food was warm, and nobody was hungry, but Margaret sat us all down and served herself first. And one by one, we followed because that was how she worked. She did not command. She modeled, and you fell into the pattern without noticing. When the plates were half finished and the silence had softened from something rigid into something tired, she spoke. "Let me tell you about Honey," she said. She set her fork down and looked at each of us. Alec, Carter, the twins, me. Her eyes were warm, but her voice was precise. The teacher's voice I had heard her use 100 times in lessons, except now the lesson was the one she had spent a lifetime waiting to teach. "When a person finds honey," she said, "they taste it, and it is sweet, and they want more. They always want more. The sweeter the honey, the more consuming the need becomes. Eventually, the need is all they are. They cannot see the hive. They cannot see the bees. They cannot see the people around them who are being stung so that they may keep eating. The honey is everything and they are nothing, and they do not know it. because the sweetness has replaced the part of them that once could tell the difference. She paused. Nobody moved. 2 people died of that, she said quietly. The Queen and the Chancellor both. They found their honey, power, wealth, control, and they ate until it consumed them. Not because they were born worse than anyone else in this room, because nobody stopped them early enough. And by the time someone tried, the honey was all that was left. Alec was the first to speak. I will have this distributed to every noble and official in the administration, as a reminder of what unchecked authority becomes. Carter nodded slowly. Children's literature too, and the church sermons. Start it early. The lesson should not wait until someone has already found the hive. I said nothing. I looked at my mother. I looked at my brothers. I looked under the table where Gordon was asleep on the rug, his belly rising and falling with the deep rhythm of something that had never needed honey because warmth had always been enough. I decided, sitting there, that the kingdom waiting for us in the morning was the one I was going to spend my life trying to deserve. The executions were carried out under law before sunrise. A steward delivered the news in the morning with the kind of quiet efficiency that meant the palace had been trained for this. Both sentences executed. No public spectacle, no further detail. The matter was closed. I stood at the window of my room and looked at the courtyard. The city beyond the walls looked the same as it had yesterday. The sun was coming up the same way. People were moving in the streets the same way. 2 people were no longer in the world, and the world had already adjusted, the way a river adjusts around a stone that has been removed. The water fills the space and moves on and does not remember the obstruction. I had expected to feel relief. What I felt was something smaller and quieter. The kingdom had moved forward 1 notch. One mechanism of the rot had been excised. The rot itself was still everywhere, in every undertrained official and every degraded medicine bottle, and every refugee walking toward the capital from a territory that had been bled dry. The Queen and the Chancellor were gone. The kingdom they had built was still here. Margaret was in my room when I turned from the window. She had come in without knocking, or maybe she had knocked and I had not heard. She was sitting on the edge of my bed with her hands in her lap, the way she sat when she had already decided she was staying, and the only question was whether I would come to her or she would wait. I went to her. She put her arm around me and I leaned against her shoulder. She smelled like lavender soap and the faint herbs from the potion lab. We did not speak. There was nothing to say that the silence was not already saying. The people who had tried to erase both of us were gone, and we were here in a room with candlelight and a window facing east, and the morning was coming. I fell asleep against her shoulder. When I woke, the candle had burned out and the sun was fully up, and Margaret was still there, reading a book with one hand, her other arm around me as though she had held that position all night and had not considered letting go. The trial was over. The kingdom was ours to rebuild. I got up, washed my face, and went to find my brothers. The refugees came in carts, then on foot, then carrying nothing at all. Within 2 months of the Queen's execution, the southern baronies emptied. 20 years of illegal taxation had hollowed those territories to the bone, and the moment the enforcer died, the people who had been too afraid to move were no longer afraid. They walked north, hundreds, then thousands. The capital's slums doubled in size before anyone had finished counting. I stood at the soup line in the southern district, ladling broth into bowls that kept coming, and I thought about the orphanage. I had grown up inside the kind of poverty these people were running from. I had not known the scale of it until they arrived 1 cart at a time, clutching bundles and children and nothing else. Margaret organized the response the way she organized everything, with warmth and speed and no wasted motion. She wrote the curriculum for the safe house that would hold the 14 recovered orphans from the trafficking ring. She sat with refugee women and held their hands while government clerks took notes behind her. She redesigned the soup kitchen rotation from 1 church to 4, and then she turned to me and said we needed healing tents bolted onto each station. So I built them. Anna ran the logistics. Dolly managed the potion supply, and Gus hauled water until his arms shook. Gordon carried bottles between stations in his mouth, trotting along the cobblestones like a small furry delivery service, and the refugees loved him before they learned a single one of our names. Alex signed a decree freezing all Southern tax collection until every baronial account was audited. Carter pushed through emergency public works, road repairs, and wall reconstruction, and military recruitment, so the refugees had wages within a week of arriving. The capital was breathing again. Barely, but breathing. A man I had served broth to the week before stopped me in the street, tools in hand, heading to a construction site. He called me Little Prince and told me the workers were grateful. I told him I had only done a little. He laughed and walked on, and the fact that he was laughing at all felt like something worth protecting. I kept making potions. It was what I did. It was what I could do. The Pharmacy Guild audit was supposed to be routine. Alec had signed the dissolution order weeks ago. The guild had been producing fraudulent medicine for 2 decades under the Chancellor's protection. All that remained was to walk through the building, inventory the assets, and confirm what everyone already knew. Carter was supposed to lead the inspection, but an emergency meeting about the Duke's military buildup pulled him away, so they sent me instead. I arrived with Martha, Gus, a night escort, 20 soldiers, and a borrowed coat that was slightly too large for a 5-year-old. The guild building was beautiful from outside, 3 stories of polished brick with tall windows. Inside, it was a shell. Every floor was empty. No staff, no equipment, no supplies. The place had been stripped. Martha's rabbit ears caught voices on the 3rd floor. We climbed the stairs in formation, soldiers first, and found the guildmaster's office at the end of a long corridor. The door was open. Inside, 6 elderly men sat around a conference table, arguing about who would take the blame for the audit. A young woman with blue hair stood near the wall, watching them. She looked like she had been watching for a long time. I walked toward the table. "Excuse me, I am Adrian." Bald paper hit me in the face, then the chest. Then one of them, a bald, heavy man, crossed the distance in 2 steps and shoved me to the floor. I landed on my backside. My borrowed coat twisted under me, and behind me, the temperature in the room dropped to 0. Martha's voice came out like a blade unsheathing. One word: arrest them. The knights moved before the old men could process what had happened. Gus stepped forward to help me up, his jaw tight, and I stood and brushed off the coat while 6 former guild leaders were pinned to the conference table and bound. They screamed about jurisdiction and authority and protocol. Nobody was listening. I had just learned something about the kingdom I was living in. The new reign had decided, right there in that room, that assaulting the youngest prince was a felony, not a procedural footnote. It was a small thing. It mattered. The young woman with blue hair was Emily. She had been hired by the guild not for her skills, but for her appearance, a gift the leadership intended to deliver to the Duke's faction as a bribe. When I asked her quietly whether the men had harmed her, she collapsed to the floor and wept. I held her head against my shoulder. I was 5 years old and too small to do much else, but I held on. Martha knelt beside us and placed one hand on Emily's back, and the 3 of us stayed like that while the soldiers searched the building around us. I will not describe what those men did to Emily. The outcome is enough. She was broken in ways that would take months to surface and longer to heal. What I can say is that the soldiers who searched the leaders' private residences that afternoon found enough evidence to bury them, and that Alex signed the arrest warrants before dinner. Margaret arrived within the hour. She took one look at Emily and bowed her head. Then she arranged a room for Emily in our household annex, beside the 3 women who had already escaped the guild weeks earlier. Emily moved in that evening. She barely spoke for the first week. By the second week, she was washing potion bottles. By the third, she was managing inventory. She never said thank you. She did not need to. She showed up every morning and worked, and that was enough. At the emergency council that afternoon, Alec dissolved the Pharmacy Guild permanently and named me its new master. I was 5. The absurdity was part of the point. Alec said as much, quietly, while the cabinet ministers pretended not to stare at the child sitting in the guildmaster's chair. The old guild had been run by seniority, and seniority had produced 2 decades of poison and fraud. A 5-year-old with appraisal magic and a functioning moral compass was, by Alec's calculation, the safest pair of hands in the kingdom. Carter added that the appointment served a second purpose. It put my face on the reform. The street already called me the Little Prince. Now they would call me the Guildmaster who made medicine that actually worked. I will do my best, I said, because I was 5 and did not yet have a more sophisticated way of accepting a national appointment. Margaret smiled. It was the kind of smile that said she had been expecting this for at least a week. The guild was rebuilt from nothing. Emily became my chief assistant. The 3 women who had arrived before her handled procurement, production management, and quality control. Dolly took the senior researcher seat and immediately began calibrating a set of magical detection instruments that let anyone, even people without sensing abilities, measure when a potion's extraction was complete. Within 2 weeks, our output tripled. The old guild's herb suppliers were contacted and offered fair prices. New distribution contracts went to street pharmacies that had been starved under the previous regime. A satellite research facility in the old Bonza's territory, run by a loud, barrel-chested woman named Carmen, who had once been a guild pharmacist herself, began producing raw medicines that filled gaps we could not cover alone. I signed documents. I reviewed supply chains. I approved procurement budgets. I was 5 years old, and my handwriting was still shaky, and I had a bedtime that Margaret enforced without exception. The adventurer couple who had found me in that forest as a newborn, Bard and Lena, arrived in the capital during the 3rd week of the rebuild. They had heard what happened. Bard ruffled my hair and laughed so hard the palace guards reached for their swords. "You were the size of a loaf of bread when I carried you," he said. "Now you are running a guild." Lena stood behind him, watching me with the same quiet attention she had shown the basket in the forest. She nodded once, as if confirming something she had already decided. They took a guild contract before leaving, and Bard told me he would be back. 1 month before the oath ceremony, I held a food distribution in the central square. It was partly humanitarian and partly tactical. The square was the ceremony road. I wanted eyes on it. Trained soldiers patrolled the perimeter. Government clerks recorded crowd flow. And in the middle of it all, sitting on a folding chair with her feet dangling above the ground, Layla was doing what Layla did. She pointed at a man near the bread tent. "That one is bad." The soldiers had walked past him twice. She pointed at a woman lingering near the fountain. Her too. She pointed at a third figure, half hidden behind a market stall. "And that one smells like coins and lies." She was 3 years old. She said it the way other children say they want a sweet. The military affairs minister, who happened to be inspecting the square that afternoon, stood perfectly still for about 5 seconds, and then asked Margaret if Layla's older sisters could join the city patrols. Lala and Lily, the older girls from our orphanage family, had the same instinct, weaker than Layla's, but sharp enough. They were stationed at adjacent food stalls that day and flagged 4 more faces the soldiers had missed. Margaret approved the request on the spot. Anna was added as patrol coordinator. Gus went as guard. The patrols launched the next morning, and within a week they had swept up 30 suspects, including operatives from the Duke's territory who had been scouting the ceremony route. Layla was told she was still too young to walk the route herself. She sulked for exactly as long as it took Margaret to promise her a honey cake. Then she was fine. I watched her bounce between patients at the healing tent, chattering to old women about soup and bad people, and whether Gordon was getting enough sleep. And I thought about what we had become, not a royal family playing at charity, a security network that nobody had planned and nobody could have predicted, built from orphans and instinct and the stubborn habit of showing up every single day. Stella's magic detection abilities folded into the patrols within the same week. She could sense concealed enchantments, forged documents, and the faint residue of communication spells. She caught 2 informants that the instinct girls had missed, and the informants had missed her entirely. The family had also grown in other ways. Alec and Carter introduced their fiancés at a palace dinner the week before the patrols began. Stella was tall, red-haired, and carried herself like someone who had been trained to throw a man to the ground, which she had. Tina was quieter, dark-haired, and had healing magic that she put to use at the soup kitchen within a day of arriving. When a pickpocket shoved an elderly woman at the food distribution, Stella dropped him with a hip throw before the nearest soldier could blink. Tina was already kneeling beside the old woman, healing the bruise before the thief hit the cobblestones. They earned the city's trust in a single afternoon. The street vendors started calling Stella the fiery bride and Tina the gentle one, and neither of them corrected it. Tina spent her afternoons in the potion workshop, strong enough to lift the heavy cauldrons that even Gus struggled with, and she and Dolly fell into a quiet working rhythm that produced more potions per day than the old guild had managed in a week. Stella joined the patrols and never missed a shift. Margaret watched them both with the look she reserved for people who had proven themselves by action rather than title. It was the highest compliment she gave. 2 weeks before the oath ceremony, Alec called a family meeting. It was small, just the siblings, Margaret, and 2 cups of tea that went cold before anyone touched them. Carter spoke first, in the measured tone he used when the news was bad and he wanted it delivered clean. The Duke's last 3 months of tax filings had not arrived. 2 of his estate stewards had been reported missing. Troop movements near the southern border suggested active recruitment. Weapons had been stockpiled. The duchy that had sheltered the Queen's faction for 20 years was not going to hand over its estates quietly. Alec said, very quietly, that the oath ceremony would likely be the next event the Duke did not attend. Margaret looked at me. "What do you think?" "He is waiting," I said. "He wants to see whether the ceremony goes smoothly. If it does, he knows the new government is stable and his window is closing. If something goes wrong at the ceremony, he moves." The room was silent for a beat. Scarlett and Lillian sat together on the far sofa, their faces still. They had been through the trials. They had watched their grandfather admit to murdering their mother without flinching. They were not children who frightened easily anymore, but I could see the weight settling behind their eyes. Alec nodded. Then we make certain the ceremony goes smoothly. Carter added that the military was already positioned. Internal operatives had been planted inside the Duke's territory. The patrols had swept the capital clean. The strong antidote potions I had been stockpiling were distributed to every guard post along the ceremony route. Nobody said the word war. Nobody needed to. That evening, I stood at the window of my palace room and watched the central square at sunset. Anna's patrol was making its rounds. 4 figures in matching night uniforms moving through the market stalls. Lala and Lily flanked Anna on either side, their small wings catching the last of the light. Stella walked a few paces behind, her eyes scanning the rooftops with the quiet focus I had come to rely on. Gus brought up the rear, carrying a basket of bread to one of the healing tents. And on his shoulders sat Layla, her gray hair bright against the orange sky. Gordon plodded behind them all, a small dark shape against the cobblestones. The guild was operational. The refugees were being fed. The healing tents were stocked. The potions were flowing to every district and half the surrounding towns. Emily was managing the supply chain I had built, with hands that no longer shook. Bard and Lena had taken their contract south and would report back before the ceremony. Stella and Tina had joined the family in a way that felt less like political arrangement and more like something they had chosen. The oath ceremony preparations were complete, and somewhere in the south, the Duke was gathering his storm. I had made my peace with it. I was 5 years old, and I ran a guild, and I made potions in a shed that had become a national institution, and I had a family that was larger and stranger and more fiercely loyal than anything I had earned in either life. The storm would come. It would come because men like the Duke could not imagine a world where a 5-year-old and an orphanage family and a kingdom of tired, hopeful people could outlast them. I watched the patrol disappear around the corner of the square, and I decided, the way I decided most things, quietly and without ceremony, that I would build until the storm broke and keep building after. The sun went down, the lamplighters began their rounds, and somewhere below, I heard Layla's voice, bright and sure, telling Gus that the bread smelled wonderful and that tomorrow she was going to find every single bad person left in the city. I believed her. The morning came, the way big mornings always come when you are 5 years old and wearing a stiff collar. Too early, too bright, too full of people who expected something from you. We had left before the sun cleared the palace wall. Margaret would follow later with Alec, Carter, and the twins. My job at the ceremony was simple. Stand on the dais. Bow when my name was called. Do not trip. The carriage rattled over the main avenue, and Layla pressed her face to the window. Flags in the royal blue and gold lined every shop front. The whole city smelled like fresh paint and baked bread. "It is so pretty," she said. The square was already filling when we arrived. A stone dais stood at the north end, ringed with a low barrier. Children sat on their father's shoulders. A man near the barrier recognized me and lifted his cap. The little prince himself, looking sharp today. "I try," I said. He laughed. Gus cracked his knuckles beside me. Anna surveyed the rooftops the way a hawk surveys a field. This was the part the crowd did not see. While Gordon padded along at Gus's heel and Layla flew a lazy circle above the dais, I had positioned every member of my family where I wanted them. Anna had the rooftop pursuit assignment. Lala and Lily could cover the skyline by air. Dolly was running her detection magic in standby. Stella was somewhere along the approach route, scanning with her own magic. Gus held the front of the stage with Gordon. Layla sat beside me, swinging her legs off the edge of the dais, humming to herself. I had assumed the Duke would strike today. 3 weeks of preparation said he would. I had placed healing potions at the medical tents before dawn, pre-mixed antidotes, burn salves, enough for 50 casualties. "Are there bad people?" I asked the twins. Lala and Lily checked. Both shook their heads. Dolly had already started her sweep, eyes half shut, fingers pressed to her temples. No hostile intent in the crowd. Nothing in the buildings I can reach. Good, for now. Gus tapped the back of my head with his open palm. "Relax, we are here." Anna folded her arms. "Leave the rooftops to me." I looked at them. 12 years old, both of them, standing in ceremonial night uniforms Margaret had given them. Gus looked like a young soldier. Anna looked like someone who had already decided how the day would end. Layla landed on the dais beside me and asked when our mother would arrive. "Soon," I told her. She accepted that and went back to humming. Gordon settled at Gus's feet like a furry boulder who had decided the morning was too loud. The square filled. The sun climbed. I watched the rooftops and waited. Lila stopped humming. It was the kind of stop that made the hair on my neck stand. Not gradual, not distracted. She went from cheerful to locked in a single breath, and her small hand shot out toward the eastern roofline. Bad people, she said. Up there. Lala and Lily confirmed it before I could speak. 2 pairs of eyes fixed on the same spot. 3 figures on the roof of a 3-story trade hall, crouched behind the lip of the building. Anna did not wait for orders. She was already moving. She vaulted the dais rail, hit the cobblestones running, and reached the building wall in 4 seconds flat. I watched her scale the facade the way anger scales a wall. Her dragonoid strength drove her boots into the stone, and she went up vertically, hand over hand, fast enough that the crowd below did not register what they were seeing until she was already over the edge. Lala and Lily flanked from the air. The twins swept along the rooftop line from opposite sides. I heard a shout, a crunch, a second crunch, a third sound that was less a crunch than a thud. 30 seconds. 3 attackers down. Dolly pressed her fingers harder against her temples. Her eyes were shut and her lips moved silently. 2 more, she said. Adjacent building to the south, 3rd floor, and another one in the building behind the tailor. I signaled the knight at the dais perimeter. He dispatched soldiers to both locations without a word. Within 2 minutes, both cells were in custody. Bows, arrows, a strange magical device nobody had seen before, all confiscated. Anna returned to the dais with a scrape on her elbow and murder in her eyes. She was not winded. She was furious that someone had dared. Amateurs, she said. They did not even post a lookout. A man in the crowd near the barrier had watched the entire rooftop operation. He shook his head slowly and spoke loud enough for the people around him to hear. Only a fool would pick a fight with this prince's family. A ripple of laughter moved through the nearby crowd. Applause followed, not for the ceremony, for the 12-year-old girl who had just run up a building and the toddler who had pointed out the targets. Layla performed one last sweep. She closed her eyes, tilted her head, and opened them with a satisfied nod. All clear now, she announced. I exhaled. The first wave was handled, but the Duke's planners were not stupid. If they had sent a rooftop team, they had sent something else too, something we had not found yet. The royal carriages arrived 20 minutes later, ornate, flanked by knights. The crowd surged with noise. Alex stepped out first. The cheering doubled. Carter followed. Margaret descended with the twins, and Stella and Tina came last in formal dresses with tiaras catching the light. Alec climbed the dais and tapped my head once, the way he always did. I hear you have been busy already, he said. The neighbors tried to visit early. We turned them away. Carter's jaw tightened. His eyes swept the rooftops, and he nodded once at Anna, who returned the nod like a soldier acknowledging a superior officer. The MC called for silence. The square obeyed. Thousands of people in every street and alley, and the only sound was the snap of banners in the wind. Alec took the sound amplification device. He held it for a moment without speaking. Then he spoke. He apologized first. He said the previous king's rule had not served the people. He said the nation had suffered and that he was sorry. The crowd stirred. A king apologizing was something this kingdom had never heard. Then he made his promise. He spoke of the future he intended to build, with Margaret and Carter and his sisters and me beside him. He spoke plainly, without decoration. Every sentence was short, every word chosen. He ended with his oath. He swore to make the kingdom bear fruit. He swore to build a future that would outlast him. The crowd erupted. The roar that came back was not polite applause. It was belief. I stood on the dais, watching my 17-year-old brother hold a kingdom in his voice, and I understood that he had been rehearsing this moment for his entire life. Not the words, the steadiness. Margaret clapped. Scarlett and Lillian clapped. The orphanage family clapped. I clapped until my hands hurt. The MC announced the succession order. Carter was heir. I was second. We stepped forward and bowed. Someone in the crowd shouted my nickname, and I pretended not to hear it. The engagements were announced. Stella as Alec's queen. Tina as Carter's wife. The crowd buzzed with recognition. They had seen both women at the soup kitchens and the patrols. They knew their faces. Margaret was named Queen Mother. A voice in the crowd called her beautiful. Another called her kind. Both were correct. The introductions were almost finished. The medal ceremony for the orphanage family was next. That was when the explosions hit. 2 detonations, back of the square. The sound was wrong, not like thunder, not like anything the city had ever heard before. A deep concussive boom that rattled the dais underfoot and sent a column of gray smoke straight up. Screams, immediate. The back of the crowd turned into a stampede. People clawed over each other to get out of the side streets. Officials shouted for calm and nobody heard them. Alec and Carter moved instantly. Knights closed around the dais in a wall of armor and drawn steel. Then the fire spell came. It came from the noble gallery, a seated area reserved for visiting dignitaries on the west side of the square. Someone in a dark hood stood up and threw a bolt of fire magic directly at me. I saw it, orange-white, moving faster than thought. Layla threw her arms up. A barrier flickered into existence between me and the flame. Pale gold, paper thin, shimmering like a soap bubble. The fire spell hit it and shattered. Sparks scattered harmlessly across the dais. The heat reached my face as a brief, warm breath and nothing more. Layla's small hands were still raised. Her face was furious, not afraid, angry. The kind of anger only a 3-year-old who loves you completely can produce. Dangerous, she announced, pointing at the gallery. Over there, Anna was already gone. She hit the wall of the nearest building at a dead sprint and went straight up. I had never seen anyone run up a wall before. I had not realized my sister could be that angry. Lala and Lily flanked her on the rooftop line. Wings spread, closing from both directions. The fire spell attacker never made it off the gallery railing. Anna reached the roof above the gallery and dropped on him from overhead. Lala caught the second figure attempting to flee along the back of the gallery. Lily blocked the exit to the street below. Gus stepped forward on the front of the dais. A man with a knife charged through the barrier gap, screaming something about revenge. Gus planted his feet and caught the man's wrist mid-swing. Gordon growled at the man's ankle. 2 knights closed the rest of the distance. The knife clattered on the stone. The man went down. Dolly's voice came from behind me, steady and clear despite the strain on her face. 1 more in the 3-story building on the south corner, and 1 running west. Black Hood, moving fast. The one in the building, Carter ordered. Soldiers, now. They went. The attacker in the building was in custody within a minute. The runner, Carter continued. Trail him. He may lead us to the rest. Dolly's eyes were shut so tight that the veins stood out on her temples. She called out the fleeing attacker's clothing and direction until the pursuit team had a fix. Then she opened her eyes, swayed once, and sat down hard on the dais steps. I counted. Every member of my family was still standing. Anna on the rooftops, Lala and Lily in the air, Gus at the front, Dolly on the steps, Layla beside me, still angry, still glowing faintly at the fingertips, Gordon at Gus's heel. The wounded were all civilians, people who had come to celebrate their new king and caught an explosion instead. I turned to Margaret. The healing tents, I said. We need to start now. She was already moving. The smoke was still clearing when Alec walked back to the center of the dais. He picked up the sound amplification device and waited. He did not rush. He let the square settle. The wounded were already being carried to the tents. The crowd, battered and frightened, turned its face toward the dais. He said the attackers had been captured. He said medical treatment would begin immediately for every injured citizen. His voice was level, measured. The voice of a man who had chosen his words 3 months ago and was delivering them now. Then he named the Southern Duke. He said the coat of arms on the captured fire spell attacker belonged to the Duke's vassal family. He stated it as fact, without anger, the way you state the weather. He said he would return to the palace to deal with those who had harmed his citizens. He said he was the king of this kingdom and that he would not permit it to stand. The cheer that came back was different from the first. That one had been celebration. This one was trust. I watched faces in the front rows, fists raised, tears on cheeks, a woman holding a bleeding child in one arm and pumping her free fist in the air. This was the moment my brother became king in the imagination of the kingdom. Not the oath, not the crown. This minute. This smoke-choked square and the 17-year-old boy who stood in front of wounded people and spoke the truth without flinching. Alex set the device down, a single look at Carter. Carter nodded and descended the dais with his knights. Alec, Stella, Tina, and the senior ministers departed for the palace. The rest of us stayed. Margaret gave the order and we went to work. My potions were already there. Burn salves, bone set elixirs, standard healing potions in 3 strengths. You do not run short during a crisis if you plan during the calm. Most of the injuries were not from the explosions. The devices had been designed for noise and smoke, not destruction. The real damage came from the stampede. Twisted ankles, broken wrists, a child with a gash on her forehead, an old man whose bad knee had given out. I moved through the line, 5 years old, formal coat stained with dust and someone else's blood, handing out potions and checking injuries with appraisal magic. A boy a little older than me tugged my sleeve. Your nice clothes are getting dirty. Clothes do not matter, I said. People do. He stared at me for a moment and then let go. Margaret worked the second tent with Scarlet and Lillian. Neither princess complained about the mess on their dresses. Tina ran the third tent with her healing magic, soft and precise. Martha coordinated the flow. Layla flew between the tents checking on everyone, occasionally landing on a patient's lap and asking if it hurt, which made people smile despite everything. We treated the wounded for 3 hours. Most walked away on their own. The serious cases were carried to the palace medical ward. The dead numbered 3, all civilians, all at the back of the square where the explosions had detonated. Their names were recorded. Their families would be compensated within the week. When the last patient left the tent, I sat down on a supply crate and looked at my hands. Dust, dried potion residue, a smear of someone's blood across my right palm. This was the part of being a prince that mattered. Not the dais, not the bow. This. Margaret told the orphanage family to go home and rest. They had earned it. Anna could barely keep her eyes open. Dolly's head was listing to one side. Gus carried Layla on his back because she had fallen asleep mid-sentence. Gordon plodded behind them like a sentry who refused to leave his post. I rode to the palace with Margaret, Scarlett, and Lillian. The meeting room was already full. Alex sat at the head of the table, Carter to his right, the Minister of Military Affairs, the Captain of the Royal Guard, aides with reports and maps. Alec acknowledged us as we sat. No pleasantries. This was not that kind of meeting. Carter delivered the first report. The captured attackers had been identified. They belonged to a minor vassal family under the Duke's banner. The magical devices were military grade. The fire spell had been cast by a man who had entered the noble gallery with forged credentials from a Duke-aligned barony. Stella's detection sweep had been pulled to the east rooftop minutes before, which gave the attacker a 30-second window. The Duke's planners had timed it perfectly. The one who escaped was being trailed. Intelligence suggested he was heading south toward the Duke's territory. The Minister of Military Affairs reported next. The Duke's tax filings had ceased. His stewards were missing. His territory was mobilized. Troop movements had been observed along the southern border for the past 2 weeks. Alec listened to everything. Then he spoke one sentence. Prepare for deployment. The minister nodded. Carter would lead the campaign. The captain of the Royal Guard would hold the capital. Then Alec looked at me. I have one more request, he said. The new Pharmacy Guild headquarters, the building Emily has been preparing. I need you to begin full-scale potion production for the front. I have been waiting for that order, I said. We can be operational within 3 days. Emily has the supply lines ready. He held my gaze for a moment longer than usual. I was not sure what he was looking for in the face of a 5-year-old sitting at a war table. I will also take responsibility for the home front, I said. The kitchens, the patrols, the pharmacy supply chain, the safe houses. I will keep it running. The room was very quiet. Margaret beside me turned her head. She did not object. She asked one question. Are you sure? I am sure, I said. Alec looked at Carter. Are you ready? Carter's fist was tight under the table. Tina was not in the room, but I knew she was somewhere in the palace, waiting. He uncurled his hand. I am ready, he said. Alex signed the deployment order. The meeting continued for another hour. Supply routes, troop numbers, fortification points along the southern road. I laid out the potion supply pipeline I had drafted during the 3 weeks of ceremony preparation. It was ready. It had always been ready. Margaret and I walked back toward our wing afterward. Gordon plodded behind us. Martha brought tea. Layla, who had woken up at the house and refused to sleep without seeing me, was dozing on my shoulder with her cheek against my collar. The kingdom was at war as of midnight. I had decided on the dais that afternoon, in the moment when the fire spell died against Layla's barrier, that I would be the kind of brother my family could rely on at the back when the front went forward. The potions that saved 3 princes. The antidote that saved my mother. The guild I rebuilt from a ransacked building. Every bit of it had been practiced for this. The war would begin in the morning. I would be ready. The green light came the same afternoon as the oath ceremony cleanup. Alex signed the activation order, and by evening, we were already packing. The new Pharmacy Guild headquarters was not what I had expected. It was a confiscated manor next door to our barren estate, seized from one of the Chancellor's disgraced allies. The walls were paneled in dark wood. The desks were finer than anything I had ever worked on, and the staff who came with the building, servants who had committed no crime themselves, lined up in the entrance hall and bowed when I walked through the front door. I was 5 years old and carrying a box of glass vials. The absurdity was not lost on me. Gus hauled crates in pairs, one under each arm, Gordon lumbering behind him with a wooden box balanced on his back. Dolly went straight for the production room, a converted warehouse at the rear of the manor, and spent the first hour fighting with the new stove. It ran on magical fuel instead of charcoal, and the temperature settings meant nothing to someone who had learned potion making over an open flame in an orphanage kitchen. The heat spikes every time I adjust it, she muttered, tapping the dial with a pair of tongs. Give me charcoal any day. Emily had already set up the records desk in what used to be the Baron's study. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this work before, under worse people, and intended to do it properly this time. The ledgers from the old guild were stacked on the floor behind her. Every one of them represented months of neglected correspondence, falsified reports, or outright fraud. I looked at the stack. It came up to my waist. In my past life, I would have called that a restructuring project. In this one, I called it Tuesday. By the next morning, the guild was operational. Potions were being produced. Emily had recruited 3 former colleagues, women who had worked under the old regime and survived it with their competence intact. The servant guild dispatched 4 additional clerks before lunch. Within 2 days, my workload disappeared. Not reduced, disappeared. The new staff took one look at the volume of paperwork I had been processing personally, 5-year-old handwriting and all, and informed me with polite horror that a guildmaster's job was to approve final documents, not to sort every invoice himself. "You are a prince," one of the dispatched clerks said, in a tone that suggested I had been committing a crime against administrative science. "Your schedule should have margins." Anna, who had been helping with the filing because Gus flatly refused and the twins claimed incompetence, gave me a look that said she had been thinking the same thing for weeks. Margaret returned from the palace that afternoon, heard the report, and nodded as though the universe had finally corrected itself. I did not know what to do with free time. I had not had any since arriving in this world. In my past life, the concept had also been largely theoretical. Margaret settled it for me. "You are going to study," she said, "and you are going to let people help you." Layla perched on Margaret's hip, pointed at me, and repeated the instruction with absolute authority. "Study." The first visitor came before the building's paint was dry. The merchant guildmaster, a broad man with a well-maintained beard and the air of someone who calculated profit margins in his sleep, arrived to pay his respects. He had been our supplier all along. The new guild's activation had pinged his network instantly. Margaret requested an increase in potion bottle deliveries to match wartime production targets. He agreed on the spot. Layla introduced herself by name and nothing else, which delighted him. She had been recognized everywhere since the ceremony, the girl who threw up a barrier to save the prince. She handled the fame the way she handled everything, with a smile and a cheerful word before going back to whatever she had been doing. He shook my hand on his way out and mentioned the all-guild meeting. I had not known there was one. The servant guild occupied a large building in the commercial district, and its leader was the most impressive-looking person I had met in either life. His name was Gray. He wore a suit that looked like it had been tailored by someone who took personal offense at wrinkles. His handshake was warm, his hands enormous, and his bearing suggested that the concept of disorder had simply given up around him years ago. Margaret explained the situation. Gray listened, nodded once, and said he would have people at our door by morning. He was as good as his word. "Your Highness," he said as we left, "I look forward to seeing you at the Guildmaster meeting." That was the second time someone had mentioned it. Alec had ordered a convening of all major guild leaders, the first in years. The old regime had let the practice die because cooperation between guilds made corruption harder to hide. The all-guild meeting convened at the palace 1 week later. I walked in with Margaret at my side and Gus a step behind me, because having a 12-year-old dog, Beastman bodyguard, was apparently my life now. The room was already half full. Gray from the servant guild stood near the door and shook my hand like we were old allies. The merchant guildmaster waved from his seat. The adventurer guildmaster, a weathered man who turned out to be the same person who had taught me and Dolly our first potion recipes years ago in the provinces, grinned at me and said I had grown. Then the chaos started. The craftsman guildmaster, a thick-armed man with calloused hands and opinions about everything, shouldered his way toward me to introduce himself. The clothing guildmaster, a stout woman with a sharp tongue and sharper eyes, cut in front of him. They began arguing about who had the right to greet me first, loudly enough that every other guild leader in the room stopped to watch. The tutor guildmaster slipped past both of them, shook my hand while they were distracted, and smiled like she had won something. I stood there with my hand extended and 2 guildmasters shouting over each other and thought, this is my professional life now. When Alec and Carter entered, the room straightened. The guildmasters bowed. Alec laid out the situation without ceremony. The Duke's territory had mobilized. Carter would lead the military campaign. Every guild in the kingdom would contribute to the war effort. Weapons from the Craftsman Guild, uniforms and field supplies from the Clothing Guild, protected supply convoys run by the Adventurer Guild, detection devices from the Magical Tool Guild, clerks and field administrators from the Servant Guild, and potions, as many as we could produce, from mine. Each guildmaster agreed. The Craftsman Guildmaster asked about weapon specifications for the new Beastman units, soldiers recruited from the very people our soup kitchens had fed. The Clothing Guildmaster pledged winter equipment. Gray offered field-grade administrators. I closed the meeting with a one-page antidote shipping schedule I had drafted with Emily the night before. It detailed quantities, delivery intervals, and routing for every potion type the front would need. The guildmasters signed it. In my past life, the closest thing to this had been a restaurant chain's quarterly budget review. The difference was that this time, the numbers meant whether wounded soldiers would have medicine in 3 weeks or bleed out waiting. I had grown up in 2 worlds. Only one of them had ever asked me to do anything that mattered. The guildmasters came to inspect the pharmacy after lunch. I walked them through every room. The production floor, where Dolly supervised a dozen workers and the new stoves had finally been tamed. The research wing, where the twins were tinkering with the magical tool potency reader, and 2 new researchers in white coats were cataloging herb samples. The storage chambers, where rows of labeled antidote vials waited in neat crates for the supply convoys. The adventurer guildmaster saw his old teaching tools still on my workbench and went quiet for a moment. Then he said I had done well with them. I told him the truth, that those tools were where everything had started. The magical tool guildmaster was an elderly woman with the gentle authority of someone's grandmother and the technical curiosity of an engineer. She spotted the potency measurement device on the research table and asked why a pharmacy guild needed one. I explained that we had discovered potion quality could be measured by tracking how much magical energy transferred from the herbs into the liquid during brewing. She patted my head and told me her own guild's young staff could learn a thing from my studiousness. The craftsman guildmaster paused in the production room and noted, with the casual certainty of someone stating weather, that beastmen were not generally suited for intellectual work. He was looking at Anna and Gus, who were both visibly engaged in production tasks. I told him I thought the issue was education, not capacity, that Anna managed our entire operation, and Gus had carried supplies through situations that would have broken most adults, that what they had lacked as orphans was not ability, but opportunity. He considered this. Then he nodded and said that was a fair point, that perhaps the kingdom's real problem was not the people, but the schools it had never built for them. It was a small moment. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody delivered a speech. But somewhere in that room, one of the kingdom's oldest assumptions shifted half an inch. Meanwhile, the clothing guildmaster had found Gordon and was petting him with both hands while muttering about winter coat textures. Gordon looked at me with the expression of someone who had been held hostage before and knew help was not coming. The weeks after the meeting moved at wartime speed. Herb shipments doubled. The production floor ran in shifts. Emily's staff processed convoy manifests every morning and supply confirmations every evening. Patrol rosters expanded. Scarlett and Lillian held the city routes. Stella ran detection sweeps alongside them. Anna commanded the street-level teams with the quiet ferocity of someone who had once managed an orphanage's grocery budget on nothing. Margaret moved between the palace and the guild like a current between 2 poles, carrying decisions in one direction and reports in the other. She was building something I had not fully understood until I saw it from above. An education framework. She used Gordon and Layla as test subjects for a new literacy curriculum, matching their different skill levels to different textbook drafts, then looping the results back to a team of palace educators who would roll the program out to the wider population once the war ended. Gordon sat through the lessons patiently. Layla treated them as a game, which meant she learned faster than anyone expected, and occasionally tried to teach the teacher. I focused on what I could control: production targets, quality checks, the potency measurement calibrations that Dolly ran every morning until the numbers held steady. By the end of the 3rd week, every vial leaving our storage room carried a verified reading printed on its label. That had never been done in this kingdom before. The old guild had not bothered because accurate readings would have exposed how diluted their potions were. Then, it was the night before Carter left. The lab was full. Margaret stood at the far end of the table, sleeves rolled to her elbows. Dolly measured herbs with the precision of someone who had been doing this since she was 8. Anna labeled vials with a pen that never paused. Stella sorted finished bottles into padded crates. Emily checked the potency reader and called out numbers. And Tina, who would have given anything to go north with Carter and could not, stood at the center of the table and brewed. She was good at it. Healing magic ran through her hands and into the mixture in ways that none of us could replicate. The antidote she produced that night tested higher on the potency scale than anything our standard process could match. Nobody said much. The work did not require conversation. What it required was the particular kind of focus that comes from knowing exactly what the bottles you are filling will be used for. When the batch was done, Tina labeled every vial in her own handwriting: batch number, potency reading, date. She packed them into a carrying case lined with wool, and she waited. Carter came to the lab just before midnight. He was in his campaign coat, already dressed for travel, his escort waiting outside with the horses. Tina met him at the door. She did not make a speech. She took 3 vials from the carrying case, the strongest of the batch, and pressed them one by one into the inside pocket of his coat. Her fingers lingered on the last one, adjusting its position so it would not shift during a ride. He put his hand over hers for a moment. Then he thanked her, and she stepped back, and that was all either of them needed. I walked him to the entrance. The building was quiet. Everyone else had gone to bed, or was pretending to. We stood in the front hall, 2 brothers separated by 12 years and a world of experience, and I extended my hand. He looked at it. Then he took it. It was the first handshake I had given in this life that I meant entirely. Not as a guild master greeting a visiting dignitary, not as a prince performing protocol, as a brother to a brother who was about to ride into a war. "Hold the back," he said. "I will." Margaret caught him at the gate. She hugged him, and she did not let go for a long time. And I looked away because some things are not meant to be narrated. When she released him, her eyes were dry. She had done this before, letting someone she loved walk into something she could not control. She had practiced. Alec appeared from the palace corridor. He had been at his desk until the last hour, and his face showed it, but he sat down at the kitchen table and shared a quiet meal with the family before the column departed. Gordon slept under the table. Layla had been carried to bed hours ago. I stood at the palace gate at sunrise and watched Carter ride out at the head of the column. Soldiers on horseback, supply wagons behind them, the antidote vials in his coat pocket, resting against his chest, carrying the work of every hand that had touched them. He did not look back. I had not expected him to. I stayed at the gate until the column disappeared past the city wall. Then I turned around, walked back inside, and went to work. The home front would hold. I had built it for exactly this. The war had been declared. The column would march tomorrow. And on the morning before that march, we were in the lab. Everyone was there. Dolly had 2 pots running at once. Emily was counting inventory against the shipping manifest. Anna was labeling vials with quick, efficient strokes, while Tina stirred the second batch beside me. Stella was sorting the finished bottles into crates by potency. Margaret had come from the palace early, and she stood at the far table, cutting antidote herbs with the calm, precise rhythm of a woman who had done field work before any of us were born. Gordon sat near the door with a stack of gauze strips, folding them into squares the way the guild staff had taught him. We had a target, 50 additional vials of strong antidote for the marching column, on top of the standard shipment Dolly had already fulfilled. Carter needed them in his supply wagons before sunrise. I was checking potency readings on the first batch when Layla stopped what she was doing. She had been handing me clean vials from a basket. She set the basket down, turned toward the window that faced the palace, and tilted her head the way she always did when something was coming. "We need more antidote," she said, bright, matter of fact, the way she always delivered it. The room went quiet for exactly 1 heartbeat. "How soon?" I asked. She thought about it. Her small horns caught the morning light. "Soon," I believed her. Everyone in that room believed her. The last time she had said something like that, the oath ceremony had nearly ended with a body count. Dolly was already reaching for the second pot. "Parallel batch. I can start another extraction if someone gets me 40 stems of antidote leaf from the stockroom." Emily left her desk without a word and came back in under a minute with the stems bundled in her arms. Anna sent a runner to the main guild floor to pull every finished vial we had in reserve. Margaret wrote a 1-line note to Alec at the palace, folded it, and handed it to a courier who was already waiting at the front door. Stella swept the household perimeter with her detection magic. Nothing yet. Within 2 hours, we had 50 additional vials boxed and ready, on top of the batch that was already crated for Carter. That would have taken a full day 6 months ago. The supply contracts, the measurement devices, the trained staff, the herb reserves Dolly had built up since phase 9 of this endless project called Running a Kingdom. All of it paid for itself in those 2 hours. "We should bring these to the military base ourselves," I said. "Carter is there for final preparations. He should see the shipment before it goes into the wagons." Margaret nodded. Stella, Tina, Scarlett, and Lillian agreed. Layla was already putting on her shoes. We loaded the crates into the carriage, and I brought my own bag with the 10 antidote vials I carried everywhere. The morning was bright, the streets were clear, and Layla sat in my lap the whole ride with her wings folded neatly against her back, staring out the window toward the palace district. She did not say anything else. She did not need to. We heard the bass before we saw it, shouting. The sharp crack of someone giving orders over a crowd that was not listening. A steward running past the gate with an armful of cloth strips. The medical wing had its emergency flag up. the red one that meant triage, and there were soldiers moving in every direction with the particular urgency of people who had been told to do something, but not what. The carriage stopped. I stepped out. Carter spotted us through the gate. He was in the courtyard, armor half buckled, jaw tight. His first reaction was confusion. "You should be at the pharmacy guild," he said. Not a greeting, an observation. Tina stepped forward. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. "We brought antidote, the regular shipment and 50 additional vials." Something shifted in Carter's expression. Relief so sudden it looked like pain. "All of it," he said. "Give me all of it." He took the crate from Tina's hands with a thank you that had no time in it, turned, and began issuing orders. Soldiers materialized. The vials went to the medical wing. A runner was dispatched to the pharmacy guild to pick up the additional stock Dolly had been producing since we left. Carter told us what had happened in short, bitten sentences. Lunch had been poisoned. Perhaps 100 soldiers down. The regiment intelligence officer had narrowed the suspect list, but had not closed it. The base's own antidote supply had been depleted in the first hour. I looked to my left. Layla was not there. I looked to my right. She was not there either. Then I heard it. 3 distinct sounds, sharp and fast, like someone cracking a whip made of heat. Fire magic. Layla's fire magic, coming from the inner courtyard. I followed the sound. Scarlett and Lillian were already running ahead of me. Stella was at my shoulder. We rounded the corner and found her. 3 soldiers were on the ground, uniforms singed, groaning, but alive. Layla was standing on one of them, with her arms raised and her wings spread, looking extremely pleased with herself. "Got the bad guys," she announced. Stella was already kneeling beside the first one. She searched his pockets and pulled out a small glass vial, half empty, sealed with wax, the toxin source. Carter arrived behind us. He looked at the 3 men on the ground, then at Layla, then at the vial in Stella's hand. "Those are the 3 we were looking for," he confirmed. His voice was flat, not with disbelief, with the specific resignation of a man who had watched this family operate before and had stopped being surprised. "The wounded soldiers in the medical wing received Tina's strong antidote within the hour. The compound was the same class the Duke's faction had been using. The saboteurs had fumbled the dosage badly enough that no one had died, but without Tina's batch, the damage would have held. Carter's command would have started the campaign crippled." Stella told me afterward that the vial contained enough concentrated toxin to have been lethal if administered correctly. The kingdom's military readiness had been saved by enemy incompetence, and a 3-year-old with fire magic. I had not intended for the household to become a quick reaction force, but the kingdom had not built another one, and the role had fallen to us the way every role did, by default, by the fact that we showed up. The chaos settled in layers. Soldiers stopped running. The medical wing flag came down. Someone brought water. Carter and Tina stood near the gate, and the space around them emptied the way it always did when they were together. Not because anyone was ordered to leave, because the warmth between them was so specific and so total that everyone within 10 paces suddenly felt like they were eavesdropping. Tina looked up at him. "Was my antidote useful?" "It saved my base," Carter said. Simple. No embellishment. Her composure cracked for exactly 1 second. She pressed her lips together, blinked twice, and nodded. I was standing far enough away to give them room, but close enough to see it. Layla was beside me, holding my hand. "We cannot get close to them," she said, watching the 2 of them with her head tilted. "No," I agreed. "Not right now." Carter eventually told us something about the post-war plan. A relative of the Duke's family, a military officer who had served the crown and had no ties to the Queen's old faction, would be installed as the new Duke after the campaign. The territory would keep continuity. The kingdom would avoid ruling it by occupation. I agreed with the strategy in my head. It was clean governance. Alex's fingerprints were all over it, but I could already hear the objections that would come from people who wanted the Duke's entire bloodline dismantled, and I understood those objections too. Some wounds want surgical repair, others want fire. The kingdom would have to decide which kind of wound this was, and not everyone would agree with the answer. Layla tugged my hand. "Can we go home now?" "Soon," I said. I watched Carter return to the barracks to brief his officers. Tina watched him too, from farther away, with both hands clasped in front of her and her back very straight. She did not cry. She would not. Not here, not in front of soldiers, not when the antidote she had brewed was the reason any of them were standing. The next morning came too fast. We arrived at the base before sunrise. The column was assembled, cavalry at the front, infantry behind, supply wagons at the rear, loaded with weapons, rations, and more antidote than any military force in the kingdom's history had ever carried into the field. Everyone had come: Margaret, Stella, Tina, Anna, and Gus, who had paused their patrol route to be here. Dolly, who had brought a final crate of supplemental vials she had finished at midnight. Gordon, who stood beside Layla near the gate, his small bare body very still. Tina went to Carter first. She held out a single vial. The glass was warm because she had been holding it against her palm the entire ride. The label was in her handwriting. "An extra strong antidote," she said. "Please keep it with you." Carter took it. He turned the vial in his fingers, reading the label, and then slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. "I will use it carefully." He hugged her. She let herself be held for a long time. Then he came to the rest of us. Margaret first. She touched his face with both hands, the way she always did before letting someone she loved walk into danger, and said 3 words I could not hear. He nodded. The twins each got a handshake and a promise to bring them something from the campaign. Anna saluted. Gus punched his own chest and said he would hold the streets while Carter held the field. Dolly told him the expiration dates on the supplemental batch and reminded him that the strong antidote had a 6-month shelf life, not 4. Carter came to me last. He held out his hand. I took it. He held on a moment longer than I expected, and for that moment, I was not a 5-year-old guildmaster standing in a military courtyard at dawn. I was his brother. He was mine. "Hold the fort," he said. "I will." He let go. He mounted. The column began to move. Tina and Layla waved until the last wagon disappeared past the city wall. Gordon pressed his head against my leg. Margaret stood behind me with one hand on my shoulder. I had told myself Carter would be back soon. I had said it because I had decided to believe it, and because deciding to believe a thing is sometimes the only way to get through the morning after the person you believe it about has ridden away. The first week set the pattern for every week after it. I was at the guild by 7 every morning. Emily had the previous day's report stacked on my desk by the time I arrived. Martha brought tea at 8, whether I asked for it or not, and she always asked if I had eaten breakfast. I always had. She always asked anyway. The pharmacy was running at wartime tempo. Dolly had the production floor on a rotation that never stopped. Strong antidote, standard antidote, basic healing potion, field-grade stamina tonic. The cross-guild supply convoys left for the front every 5 days, each one carrying more bottles than the last. Emily tracked every shipment against a manifest she had built herself, and the numbers were always right. I signed approvals. I reviewed reports. I met with the servant guild's clerks who handled the administrative side. The staff had told me months ago that a guildmaster should only handle final decisions, and I had finally learned to let them be right about that. Carter's first letter arrived on day 6. Tina read it aloud at dinner. The march was on schedule. No combat yet. The Duke's forces had pulled back behind their outer fortifications. Carter's advanced scouts reported low morale in the enemy ranks, and a steady trickle of deserters heading south. The siege would begin within the week. Tina read the whole letter with perfect composure. Her voice did not break once. She folded it when she was done, placed it beside her plate, and resumed eating. Nobody said anything. Nobody needed to. Margaret had given Stella and Tina an assignment the morning Carter left: teach Gordon and Layla to read. It was a gift disguised as a task, or a task disguised as therapy, or both. Margaret understood that Tina needed her hands full and her mind occupied, and she understood that teaching a 3-year-old demon child and a 6-year-old bear cub to read was exactly the kind of problem that would consume every spare thought Tina had. It worked. By the second week, Layla could sound out 3-letter words. She sat at the library table with her wings folded, her small horns catching the afternoon light, and read each word aloud with the fierce concentration of someone diffusing a trap. Gordon was slower but patient. He pressed one paw against the page, followed the letters with his nose, and produced sounds that were almost words. When he got one right, his whole body wiggled. Stella corrected their pronunciation gently. Tina made flashcards. Martha brought them snacks at 3 every afternoon. I joined the lessons in the evenings when I got home from the guild. Some nights, I sat in the back of the library and listened to Layla read a full sentence, word by word, and felt something I could not name. The kingdom was at war. The frontline dispatches arrived every 3 days. The patrols walked the streets every night. The curfew held. And in this room, 2 children who had been thrown away by the world were learning to read, taught by 2 women who would one day be queens, in a house that belonged to a family that had chosen every one of its members on purpose. That was worth holding. The patrols never stopped. Anna ran the street-level operation with the precision of someone who had been managing logistics since before she was tall enough to reach a filing cabinet. She divided the capital into sectors, assigned rotation schedules, and expected reports by sundown. Gus walked beside her on most routes, and nobody in the market district caused trouble when they saw a 12-year-old dragonoid girl with a face that said she had already thought of every excuse they might try. Scarlett and Lillian took the Noble District. Their intuition caught 2 more informants the Duke's network had planted in the markets during the 3rd week. Stella accompanied them on inspection days, running detection sweeps, and the combination of a noble fiancé and 2 princesses patrolling in person kept the streets orderly. Bard and Lena had arrived from the Old Territory the week before. Bard walked the Adventurer Guild halls, checking for recruitment scams the Duke's remnants were running. Lena handled the intelligence side quietly, the way she handled everything. I visited the patrol routes twice a week. I brought potions for distribution. I talked to the shop owners. I handed out antidote packets at the soup kitchens we had set up in the lower quarters, and I made sure the patrols saw me doing it. A 5-year-old prince handing out medicine is either absurd or reassuring, depending on your situation, and most of the people in the lower quarters were in situations where reassuring won. The weeks braided together. Every evening, the household gathered for dinner. Margaret came home from the palace with whatever news Alec had cleared for sharing. Tina read Carter's letters. The rest of us ate and listened and did not ask questions we already knew the answers to. Carter's letters grew shorter as the campaign progressed, but the facts in them were good. The outer fortifications fell in the 3rd week. The Dukes' hired mercenaries surrendered in the 4th. By the 5th week, Carter's forces had reached the inner territory, and the Duke's remaining garrison had pulled inside the castle walls. Dolly reported production numbers every night, like a general delivering a field briefing. She was in the lab 15 hours a day, and her fingertips had turned faintly green from antidote herb residue, and she did not mind. The frontline convoys had not missed a single delivery since the campaign began. Martha brought me tea at midnight on the nights I stayed late at the guild reviewing supply manifests. She never asked why I was still awake. She just set the cup on the desk corner, adjusted the lamp wick, and left. One night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I sat in my room and looked at the city through the window. The curfew lamps were burning on the main road. A patrol lantern moved slowly through the market district. The palace was lit at the top floor, Alec's study, where I knew he was still at his desk. I was 5 years old. I was running a pharmaceutical guild, a supply chain to a war front, a charitable distribution network, a household education program, and a city patrol system. The king trusted me with the home front. My brother was fighting a war with antidote I had mixed. My mother brought me progress reports between palace meetings. In my past life, I had died on a hospital cot with nobody at my bedside. I had been the kind of person the world set down and walked away from. I had no family. I had no one. Now, I had everyone. And the weight of that was not lighter than having no one. It was heavier, infinitely heavier. Because if having nothing means you cannot lose anything, then having everything means every single thread can break, and you feel every one of them humming. I picked up the tea Martha had left. It was still warm. I went back to work. The dispatch arrived at the palace gate at sunset on the 53rd day. Margaret brought it home herself. She did not send a courier. She walked through the front door with the paper in her hand and her eyes bright and said 5 words. "The Duke's castle has fallen." Tina, who had been in the library with Gordon and Layla going over reading practice, stood up from the table. She did not speak. Her mouth opened. Nothing came out. She sat back down, put both hands flat on the table, and cried without sound. Layla climbed into her lap and wrapped both arms around her neck. Gordon pressed against her leg. Margaret stood at the doorway and let her cry. I stood behind Margaret and read the dispatch over her shoulder. Carter's force had taken the principal castle. The Duke was in custody. The campaign's main objective was complete. Occupation and handover to the designated successor would take another few weeks, but the fighting was done. Casualties were lower than projected, in part because the antidote stockpile had neutralized every poison class attack the Duke's forces had attempted. Our potions, our production line, Dolly's shifts, Tina's batches, the household that had stood in a lab on the morning before the march and made 50 extra vials because a 3-year-old said they would be needed. I went to my desk that night. I opened the guild ledger. I wrote a single line on the day's entry. No more shipments. Pending stand down. I closed the book. I turned off the lamp. Martha had left tea on the corner of the desk. It was still warm. I drank it. I went to bed. For the first time in 8 weeks, I did not dream about supply manifests. 2 weeks after the dispatch, Layla spotted them first. She had been flying above the military base gate every afternoon since the message arrived, circling in slow loops with her wings spread. eyes fixed on the road south. Stella stood below her as ground spotter, one hand shading her face against the setting sun. Margaret had approved the arrangement. Nobody had needed to ask twice. On the 14th afternoon, Layla dropped 3 feet in the air, hovered, and cupped her hands around her mouth. "I can see them!" Her voice carried across the courtyard with the bright certainty of a child announcing dinner. A column of riders had appeared on the road, dust rising behind them, the front horse larger than the rest. Tina was beside me. She had been beside me every afternoon for 2 weeks, standing at the base gate in the same lavender dress, hands folded, posture perfect, saying nothing. The moment Layla's voice hit the air, Tina's composure broke in one clean motion. She stepped forward, then walked, then ran. Her shoes struck the packed road, and she did not look back. Carter saw her before she reached him. He swung down from his horse in one motion, passed the reins to his lieutenant without a word, and caught her. I did not hear what they said. I do not think they said anything. Tina's arms went around his neck, and Carter's hand went to the back of her head, and they stood in the middle of the road while the column moved past them on either side like water around a stone. Layla had no patience for protocol. She launched herself from the gate, crossed 30 feet of air in 2 wing beats, and collided with Carter's side hard enough to stagger him. He caught her too, one arm around Tina, the other scooping up a small demon child with horns and a grin the size of the sunset behind her. Margaret went next. She walked to him at the pace she always used when she wanted you to know she was not rushing, and she put both hands on his face and held it and said something I could not hear. Carter closed his eyes. Scarlett and Lillian broke into a run together, arrived together, and wrapped themselves around him from either side. Scarlett punched his shoulder. Lillian told him his hair was longer. Carter laughed for the first time in 2 months. Alec waited. Protocol demanded it. The king greets the returning commander last, formally, with witnesses. But when Carter finally turned toward him, Alec crossed the remaining distance in 4 steps, pulled his brother into a one-armed embrace that lasted exactly 3 seconds, and released him. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them needed to. I shook his hand. It was the same handshake we had built before he left. Palm flat, grip steady, 1 second longer than necessary. Carter held it the way he had on the morning of departure, and I felt the weight shift between us. He had left carrying mine. He had come back carrying his own. "Welcome home," I said. His grip tightened once. Then he let go. Gordon had waddled out to the road behind me. Carter knelt, scratched behind his ears, and Gordon pressed his whole body against Carter's knee and stayed there. The column filed past us into the base. The road dust settled. The sun touched the horizon. We rode back to the palace in 2 carriages, and Tina did not let go of Carter's hand the entire way. I had not realized until that minute how much weight I had been carrying. The debrief happened in the reception room. Carter stood at the head of the table. Everyone was present. The Duke's command had collapsed faster than anyone expected. 2 decades of the Queen's faction shielding them from consequences had produced a leadership structure built for corruption, not war. When a real army appeared at their border, the chain of command fractured in under a week. The advance force had swept the outer garrisons before Carter's main column even arrived. He reported it plainly, the way Alec ran his briefings. No embellishment, numbers, timelines, outcomes. Then he got to the potions. Carter turned to me. His voice did not change, but his eyes did. The antidote stockpile I had shipped to the front had been used, almost entirely, but not the way any of us had planned. The Duke's army had crumbled so quickly that the soldiers barely needed medical intervention. The casualties Adrian had prepared for had not materialized at the scale he had feared. The civilians had. The Duke's territory had been gutted. 2 decades of corrupt governance had stripped every institution to the frame. The pharmacies were empty shells running on bribes. The hospitals had been defunded. When the Duke's army retreated behind the castle walls, the civilians caught between the lines had no medicine, no healers, and no supply chain. Carter's medical officers used the antidote stockpile to treat them, not soldiers, civilians, hundreds of them, across 12 towns in the Duke's territory. Women, children, elderly, people who had lived under a corrupt lord for 20 years and had never once received medicine that worked. The boy who made potions in a shed had changed the outcome of the war, not by saving his own side's soldiers, by saving the other side's people. I sat with that for a long moment. Carter was not finished. He looked at Tina. The 3 strong antidote vials she had pressed into his coat pocket the morning he left had stayed within arm's reach of the new Duke from the moment of his installation. On the 3rd day of the new Duke's tenure, a former servant loyal to the old regime had laced his evening meal. Carter had recognized the symptoms instantly, the same compound toxin pattern we had seen at the military base. He had administered Tina's vial within minutes. The new Duke survived. The territory's succession held. The duchy did not collapse again. "Your antidote saved him," Carter said to Tina, plainly, without ceremony. Tina's hands, folded in her lap, tightened until her knuckles went white. She did not cry. She nodded once. Carter turned back to me. "The potions saved more lives than I expected to save. I was ready for a siege. I got a surrender, and the people who actually needed help were the ones your supply chain reached." He paused. "The medicine you made in a shed, the medicine Dolly and Tina and your whole household made in that lab. It did not just support a campaign, it held a territory together." I did not have a good answer for that. I had spent 8 weeks running a supply line, thinking about soldiers, thinking about Carter, thinking about what the front needed. It had not occurred to me that the front would not need most of it, and that the people who needed it most would be the ones nobody had been thinking about at all. The home front work and the frontline work had been the same work all along. I had just been looking at it from the wrong end. The rest of the debrief was structural. The old Duke was in custody and would face trial at the Capitol under the same procedural framework that had convicted the Queen and the Chancellor. The new Duke, a military officer from a branch of the family with no ties to the old regime, was holding the territory. A permanent garrison would remain. Tax reform in the duchy would begin in the new year. Alec asked about education. Carter told him the literacy rate in the Duke's territory was lower than anything they had seen in the capital. Margaret leaned forward at that. She had been collecting data from the soup kitchens for months, studying how Anna had taught reading at the orphanage, compiling methods. The two problems were the same problem. A kingdom that could not read was a kingdom that could be exploited. Alec had understood that before the war. Now, the data proved it. Carter mentioned the adventurer school planned for the old territory where we had grown up. Alec had moved it forward after the recruitment scams the Duke's network had run. Trained adventurers meant fewer people who could be tricked, fewer who would follow a corrupt lord into a dead-end contract. Everything connected. The corruption the Queen and Chancellor had planted 20 years ago had produced the soil the Duke's rebellion grew in. Pulling out the roots would take years, but the tools were being built. Alec announced the emergency declaration was lifted. The curfew would end. Shops could stay open past midnight again. The war was over. Carter sagged in his chair by exactly 1 inch, the first visible sign of exhaustion I had seen from him since he walked through the gate. Tina put her hand over his on the armrest. He did not move it. 6 weeks passed. The season turned. The new year arrived. I had turned 6 the day before. Margaret had baked a small cake herself, which she had not done since the orphanage days, and the household had sung. Gus sang off-key. Gordon had tried to eat the candles. Layla had given me a card she had written herself. Every letter labored and enormous, that said "Happy Birthday, Adrian" in handwriting that looked like it had survived a windstorm. I kept it. The morning of the New Year's audience, I dressed in the formal coat Martha had laid out, dark blue with gold trim, white shirt with a collar stiff enough to remind me I was 6, and was about to stand before every noble in the kingdom. The same coat I had worn on the day Alec had first named me. It had been let out twice since then. I was growing. The audience chamber was full. Every noble family in the kingdom had sent representatives. The stone benches curved in a half circle around the raised platform where the throne sat, and the stained glass threw colored light across the marble floor in patterns that shifted as clouds moved past the winter sun. I stood in the royal family line, Alec on the throne, Carter to his right, in formal military dress, standing straighter than I had ever seen him. Then Scarlett, then Lillian, then Margaret, who stood with the quiet authority of a woman who had earned every inch of the floor beneath her. Then me. I was the smallest person on the platform, and I was aware of it. Alec rose and spoke. He thanked the kingdom for the year. He acknowledged the rebellion, the war, the losses. He named the soldiers who had died, 4 of them, and the room was silent for each name. He described the reforms in progress: tax adjustment, infrastructure, literacy programs, the adventurer school, the pharmaceutical supply chain that had held through a military campaign. Then his voice shifted by half a register, and I knew what was coming. He announced that he and Stella would marry in spring, that Carter and Tina would marry in spring. A joint ceremony held together to reduce expense and consolidate the security requirements into a single event. The nobles applauded. It was a good sound, not performative, genuine. Alec was not finished. He named the orphanage family, one by one. Anna, Dolly, Gus, Lala, Lily, Gordon, Layla. He named them as guests of the wedding. Not staff, not household attendants, guests. He assigned Lala, Lily, Gordon, and Layla the ceremonial flower duties, the white petal procession that traditionally cleansed the aisle before the brides walked it. The kingdom had just told the rest of the kingdom, out loud, from the throne, that the orphanage family counted as family. Then he said my name. He named me as the kingdom's pharmacy guildmaster and second in line of succession. He said it plainly, the way he said everything that mattered. I stepped forward. The hall was silent. Every face in the room was watching a 6-year-old boy in a blue coat step to the edge of a platform he had not been born onto. I bowed. The silence held. I stepped back, and I understood, standing there with the stained glass light on my shoulders, that the thing I had been most afraid of had stopped being a thing I was afraid of. It had happened months ago. I had been too busy to notice, too occupied with supply manifests and antidote batches, and literacy reports, and patrol schedules, to sit still long enough to feel the shift. The boy who had been set down in a forest on the 5th day of his life had just been named before every noble in the kingdom, and he had not flinched. The audience ended at midday. By evening, we were home. Margaret had asked everyone to dinner. Nobody refused. The dining room table, which she had ordered, expanded the month before in anticipation of exactly this kind of evening. Now seated 16. Every chair was full. I sat between Margaret and Dolly. Carter was across from me with Tina at his side. Alec had taken the head of the table, which put him directly opposite Margaret, and neither of them seemed to mind the symbolism. Scarlett and Lillian flanked Carter. Stella sat beside Alec. Anna and Gus held the far end with Martha between them. Layla had insisted on sitting in a chair instead of on someone's lap, and she managed it by kneeling on the cushion with her wings folded behind her like a small, horn-bearing dignitary. Gordon had started the evening on a chair. By the second course, he was under the table, asleep against the table leg, snoring with the slow rhythm of a creature who had never in his life worried about whether he belonged. The meal was nothing ceremonial: roasted bird, vegetable stew, fresh bread Martha had baked that afternoon, wine for the adults, juice for the rest of us. Dolly was arguing with Anna about whether the new measurement device was producing reliable readings on antidote viscosity. Anna maintained that the calibration was fine. Dolly maintained that the variance between batches was outside acceptable range, and that if Anna had spent any time in the lab recently, she would know that. Anna said that if Dolly had spent any time managing logistics recently, she would know that a 2% variance was well within operational tolerance. It was the same argument they had been having since the orphanage. The words had gotten longer. The stakes had gotten higher. The rhythm was identical. Scarlett was asking Tina about the wedding dress. Tina said she had not had time to think about it. Scarlett said that was unacceptable and that she and Lillian would handle it. Lillian agreed immediately. Stella, who was Alec's bride-to-be and probably should have had an opinion, said she trusted them and returned to her soup. Carter was talking to Alec about the garrison resupply schedule, and Margaret was correcting them both on a logistical point they had gotten wrong. And for a moment, the table sounded exactly like a war council, except that Martha was passing the breadbasket and Gus was on his third helping. I ate. I listened. I watched. After dinner, I went to my desk. The guild ledger sat where I had left it. I opened it to the last page of the campaign supply book. The final shipments had been delivered. The accounts were reconciled. The branch expansion plan Alec and I had reviewed the week before was approved for the kingdom-wide rollout in spring. I wrote the closing entry, final line, signed and dated. I closed the book. I said goodnight to Martha at the doorway. She bowed and told me the tea was on the desk if I wanted it later. Margaret was already in my room, sitting in the reading chair by the window, a book open in her lap. She looked up when I came in and smiled in the way that meant she had been waiting, but would never say so. I climbed into bed. The sheets were warm. Gordon had followed me from the dining room and was now curled on the rug beside the bed, his back rising and falling with each slow breath. I lay in the dark and listened to Margaret turning pages, and Gordon snoring, and the last sounds of the household settling in for the night. Somewhere downstairs, Dolly was still in the lab. Somewhere across the estate, Anna was reviewing tomorrow's patrol routes. In the palace, Alec was at his desk. In their room, Carter and Tina were together, and the war was behind them. I had been thrown away twice. Once on a hospital cot in a life that ended with nobody at my bedside, and once in a forest on the 5th day of a life I had not asked for. I had not chosen to be born back into this world. I had not planned any of what had followed, but 16 people had eaten dinner at that table tonight, and every one of them had insisted I be there. The orphan, who had died alone in his first life, would not have believed this one. I was learning to believe it anyway. I closed my eyes. Margaret's pages rustled. Gordon shifted on the rug and pressed his nose against my dangling hand. I fell asleep.